Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Illinois Learn to Hunt Deer Hunting 102. This is a follow-up to our 101 course. So 101, we kind of did a deep dive into the regulations and how to make you a legal hunter in Illinois, and then went over how to find land and sites and habitat, and then go into a little bit of scouting a little bit. So this course, we're gonna change that up a little bit and go over some more deer and a little bit more on how to handle a deer after you take your shot. So those are the main things we're going to be talking about tonight. Just some housekeeping things before we get started. Please stay muted. Don't turn on your videos. And if you have any questions, put them in the chat section. So if our sound goes out at all, you can put that in the chat so that way we know you guys can't hear us. And if anything else happens, just put it in the chat and we'll try to answer your questions within there. Or the person who's talking will answer your questions through the video. There you go. Dan says good evening. So that is our presenter there. So what else? Oh, so we will also be sending out a copy of this PowerPoint, a recording of this webinar, and a survey within the next couple days. We do send we send the video out, the recording out to get closed captioning put onto it professionally. So that way that will be available for anyone who needs that. So please fill out those surveys, though, that we're sending out to you guys. That really helps us understand who our audience is and also what we need to do to help build this up and make this as best of a learning experience for everybody, and see if there's any information that we're not covering as we develop these webinars. Because these webinars are new this year. Usually this program is hands-on workshops, but we've pivoted with COVID and whatnot. So we're figuring this out as we go. So help us figure that out with us, please. Okay, so moving on. So course outline. So today we're going to talk about deer ecology. If you took our 101 course a couple days ago, this is going to be a review, but it's some really good information on understanding deer behavior and the different hunting strategies you need throughout the season. Then we're going to talk about deer vocalizations, calling, rattling, when to do it, when not to do it, the different types there are. And then we're going to go over different types of ways to control your scent before going out and how important that is. Then we're going to talk about different scents that you can buy off the shelf that you can use as lures and attractants and cover scents. Then we'll go over the different types of basic tree stands. Then talk about after the shot and how to read an arrow and see the deer body language and how to track a deer. And then we're going to briefly go over how to field dress a deer. And then we're going to finish off the evening by just a little summarization of CWD, the chronic wasting disease that's in the northern part of the state. Mostly. So we'll go over that at the end there. And our presenters tonight, we got Dan Stevens. Dan, you want to say hi?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. And we also have Adam with us. Adam, would you like to say hi?
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for joining us, and hope you guys learned something from our video here.
Fantastic. All right, and then I'm Jason Buckley. Welcome. So we're going to have Dan start us off by talking about habitat and ecology of white-tailed deer.
Perfect. Thanks, Jason. And like Jason mentioned, this, for those of you who have seen the Deer Hunting 101 course or maybe have been hunting for a few years, this will likely be mostly a review or kind of a refresher. But it's really important to kind of set the stage for how we're going to kind of move through this specific webinar. And the way I like to approach deer ecology is viewing it seasonally. Obviously, for those of you who have hunted before, you will know that your hunting strategies are going to differ significantly between October 1st and the end of January. And so we're going to take a deep dive into deer ecology and see how we can use some of those behaviors and some of those techniques and habitat use that deer follow, and how we can use that as hunters to increase our likelihood of success while we're out there. So just a quick overview of deer habitat. Deer are a very general species. They are not very specialized like some species. They can pretty much live in a wide variety of habitats. But one thing I want to make abundantly clear is, if you look at a lot of the kind of modern hunting related videos and different TV shows and magazines and movies, you see these real park-like settings where it's kind of big, mature oak stands with very manicured kind of understory, and it's not real thick. And obviously they're doing that due to the ease of filming and a lot of other things. But it's important to remember, deer typically don't like to spend their time in areas that are open like this. They typically like the more fringe areas and a lot of times more thicker cover. So keep that in mind as we kind of move through this, that don't just think about deer hunting as, sitting in a big mature, maybe oak or hickory forest, but perhaps sitting on a prairie strip or on some different other habitat types. So with that, we'll dive right in. Obviously, deer are a very abundant species, specifically white-tailed deer. You can see a quick map of their native range in the United States, and you can see they pretty much cover the majority of this country. So there's a lot of variety in their habitat use as well as their behavior. So the kind of ecological timeline that we're going to use for this section is really going to relate more so to the Midwest whitetail. If you were to go further north or further south or even east or west, things will differentiate a little bit. So just keep that in mind as we move through this, that we're really focused on kind of that Midwest style hunting, and particularly Illinois. So the main breeding season for deer is rut. Rut occurs primarily during October and December, although there is what we call peak rut. And we'll get into this as we kind of move a little bit further. But peak rut is typically that second week in November is when you see peak breeding activity. And typically that's followed by an increased level in testosterone of the males. And so once that testosterone starts peaking, it causes these males to switch to breeding mode, and that's where they're going to focus most of their time. Deer are what's known as crepuscular. So we have the term nocturnal, which means active during the night. We have diurnal, which is active during daylight hours. And then we have this term crepuscular. Crepuscular essentially means kind of active at those twilight hours. So that hour before sunrise, or that hour after sunrise to kind of an hour after sunset. So those dawn to dusk. Deer have an excellent sense of smell. As hunters, that is kind of the primary sense that we're trying to fool and trying to evade, is that sense of smell. They also have very good eyesight and kind of decent hearing. The fawns are precocious, which means when they're born at kind of a pseudo-mature state, meaning they can survive on their own a lot more so than other species. And oftentimes when you see a family group of does, oftentimes on that trail, it's going to be led by the fawn, and kind of the rest of the family group is just kind of following behind that fawn. So now we're going to take this kind of deep dive into the timeline of deer ecology. And archery season in Illinois starts October 1st, which for all of those paying attention, that's just a few weeks away. So that's something definitely to look forward to. But early October is an interesting time to be in the whitetail woods, particularly because after this long summer and the leaves are starting to change, deer are becoming more active. During the summer months, particularly on public land, they've almost had a sanctuary. They're not being pressured, they're not being hunted, and so they're stuck to a lot more kind of definitive patterns, if you will. So they're not trying to evade people or other predators at this point as much. They're really focused on just kind of this feeding to bedding pattern and just kind of living their life. And so early October is a really good time to focus on that bed to feeding strategy, particularly if there's agricultural crops near the property. And I know a lot of people, you may not have these on the specific property that you're hunting, but even if those agriculture lands are kind of in the area or in the vicinity of that property, chances are the deer are going to be using those agriculture crops at one point or another. So it's just important to keep in mind. I typically don't start a lot of my deer hunting efforts. Obviously, I'm going to go out early October, but what I really like to focus on is once those standing crops start to be removed from the landscape, that's when deer are going to really start to switch to their kind of more fall and winter patterns. And that's when it can be a good time to really invest in scouting and start trying to figure out these animals. But early October is a great time to just, again, focus on where they bed, where they feed, and try to get somewhere in between. And as hunting pressure kind of increases through October, you'll hear a lot of people use the term the October lull. And essentially the October lull is when deer start to essentially realize the pressure that is starting to be out in the woods. So they're noticing people stumbling around with flashlights at 4 a.m. They're getting jumped out of their bedding sites. And so they're starting to notice a lot of this pressure. And what that does is it starts to cause these animals to shift their patterns just a little bit more nocturnal. Oftentimes it might even only be a 30-minute interval to an hour, kind of pushed further back. But if you're set up on a feeding location and they typically get to your area 15 to 30 minutes right before shooting light, well, as they start to switch to this more nocturnal pattern, now they're not crossing your location until it's essentially after legal light is over. So it is important to remember as you kind of move through mid-October, their patterns will start to shift, and that shift is oftentimes dictated a lot by pressure. And so just keep that in mind. Mid-October, if you're really struggling to get eyes on deer during daylight hours, it's often a good chance and a good opportunity to get a little bit closer to the bedding location. So that way, when they do happen to cross by you, theoretically, it's still within that legal shooting light. Now, as we get to late October and early November, this is when things really start to ramp up in the woods. Deer, especially bucks, are starting to see an increased level of testosterone. And there's a lot of theories out there that are kind of perpetuated by the hunting community about what triggers rut. A lot of it kind of stems from moon phases to weather, but in reality, what really dictates rut is this testosterone level in males. And what dictates that testosterone level is essentially the photo period. So how much daylight is available in a specific calendar day. And the nice thing is that doesn't fluctuate year to year. Hence, the majority of peak rut activity is going to occur around the same day every single year. And that is typically kind of November 12th to November 18th is kind of peak rut for most of the state of Illinois. Of course, that's going to differ depending on if you're a little further north or south, but that second week in November is classified by a lot of people as kind of peak rut. But before we get to that peak rut, as these testosterone levels are starting to rise, the bucks in particular are starting to focus less on feeding. They're starting to focus less on security. So they're not as conscious of their surroundings. And they're going to be focusing primarily on trying to find that first female that is in estrus or in heat and is kind of ready to breed. And so that's why late October and early November can be such a productive time if you're trying to fill a buck tag. And that's because the bucks, again, they're starting to drop a lot of their security and they're just focusing on those females. So it's a great opportunity to basically catch a deer making a mistake. And that's what you'll start to see as we transition to rut, is these deer are going to be a lot more active. They're not as cautious, and they're going to be using areas that they typically don't utilize. Now, when I'm looking to start planning a lot of my kind of pre-rut efforts, so late October, early November can kind of be classified as pre-rut. But once I start seeing scrapes and rubs developing in the landscape, that's a pretty good signal to most hunters that testosterone level is starting to increase. Bucks typically don't make scrapes and rubs outside of rut. They occasionally will, and they'll occasionally use them, but primarily that's a communication tool used during rut. And so you really start to see around mid-October is when you start to see the first scrapes and rubs. And you can start to see them early October as well, but you'll really start to see them around Halloween and into late November. And the real nice thing about these rubs and scrapes is they're essentially communication platforms for deer. Obviously, deer can communicate through vocalizations, but they can also communicate using pheromones and scent. And so that's kind of what these rubs and scrapes are, is communication tools. Well, a buck, when he makes a scrape or a rub, he's not just kind of leaving that, just making it and letting it sit and going on about his way. He wants to actively check those scrapes and rubs. So typically they're going to be checking these rubs and scrapes roughly every 24 to 48 hours. And so that can be a really good opportunity as a hunter. If you see an active scrape line or an active rub line, you can start to kind of use that in some of your hunt planning processes. Now, one of the big concerns about hunting over rubs and scrapes is a lot of the research where they have GPS collared deer and they can kind of track their every movement. What those studies have shown is that a lot of the time a buck is checking a scrape or a rub, it's typically between like 1 and 4 in the morning. So when you do find a rub or a scrape line, utilizing a trail camera can be a really good indicator of it's going to tell you basically when that deer is using that rub or scrape line. And if he's consistently hitting it in the middle of the night, pretty good chance it's probably not worth sitting there. But in the same scenario, if you find out he's hitting it at daylight hours, that can be a real good opportunity to set up on. Now, as we get to early November and mid-November, this is when peak rut really starts to take off. Deer are starting to become more daylight active. The bucks are not focused on feeding, on drinking, on bedding, or anything. They're focused on one thing, and that's breeding as many does as they possibly can in a day. Now, the nice thing about early November to mid-November is that you essentially have a lot of does coming into estrus at the same time. In kind of late October, you start to have a few does come into estrus, and you might have, 5 or 6 bucks harassing this one individual doe. But as you get closer to peak rut, when most of these does are kind of in estrus together, that's when bucks will really start kind of increasing their territory and just running across the countryside trying to breed as many does as they can. Now, when they do breed does, they're typically going to be locked up with that individual doe tending her, and he's going to tend her for about 24 to 48 hours. So if a buck is successful in breeding a doe, you can pretty much eliminate being able to see him for a few days, unless you happen to jump him out of his bed. When they're tending, they're going to be in really thick areas, and they're just going to lay there, and every so often they'll get up and breed and then kind of lay back down, and they're just going to stay together. But once he's kind of finished breeding that doe after the 24 to 48 hours, he's going to be back on the hunt to find another one. And so that's why rut is so, it's kind of put on a pedestal by a lot of hunters. And that's simply because, again, the security of the deer goes down. They're not focusing so much on danger or on food. They're just focused on kind of this breeding pattern. And that can oftentimes lead to a lot of exciting hunts. I've had a few hunts where you might see, 15 or 16 different bucks just kind of running across the countryside chasing a single doe or chasing a group of does. And so it can be a real advantageous time to be in the woods. And most hunters, if they're going to take off time for work or take off vacation, early November to mid-November for a lot of people is going to be that time that they take off. And that's simply just due to kind of this behavior of rut that you'll see. It's a great time to start calling, which we'll kind of dive into in a little bit. And it gives you a lot of flexibility during rut. And typically when we're deer hunting, again, deer are crepuscular the majority of the season. So they're active at those kind of twilight hours, either right at dawn or right at dusk. And so a lot of deer hunting is actually occurring in the first few hours of the day or the last few hours of the day. But the nice thing about rut is, again, all that goes out the window, and all day sits can be very productive this time of year. You can see a lot of midday activity. And so kind of keep that in mind as you're planning, that even afternoon and kind of midday hunts can be very, very, very productive during this time. I saw we had a question from Lem. Should we be in our deer spot before the sun comes up? Great question, and ideally, yes. So typically, I personally like to get into my spot or into my stand and be completely set up about an hour before sunrise. So if you remember, the shooting hours for deer hunting are 30 minutes before sunrise to 30 minutes after sunset. And so I want to be in my stand about 30 minutes before that first minute of legal light. That allows the woods to kind of settle down, get things quiet again, and kind of, for me, to relax as well. Oftentimes I'm walking and carrying a lot of gear kind of back in pretty deep areas. So oftentimes I'm kind of sweating, breathing heavy. So it's nice just to get up there and relax for a few minutes before things get good. But I would recommend trying to get in the stand roughly 30 minutes before legal shooting light, just to, again, give the woods a chance to kind of quiet down and come back to the way they were before you were tromping through there. So now we'll kind of move on to late November. Late November, again, we're right at kind of the tail end of rut. You might still see some rutting activity, but at this point, the majority of does have either been bred or are now out of their estrus cycle. And so they're going to be focused back on this feeding pattern. And bucks, they're going to start to try and recover from rut as well. As you'll see in another slide, but I'll go ahead and mention it now, the average buck can lose up to 15 to 20% of his body weight during rut. And so that's a significant chunk of fat storage that he's essentially losing just during a few weeks. And so the rest the majority of the rest of fall and kind of early winter is trying to restore those fat reserves so that he has the ability to survive during winter. And so you'll start to see the bucks start to transition back to kind of feeding patterns in late November. But now that we get into December and January, this is where you'll hear a lot of people use the term late season. And so late season is essentially, we'll just kind of classify December and January as late season. So it's after rut, it's after the majority of the firearm seasons. So things are, a lot of times you'll see a lot less pressure in the woods at this point too. But December and January, the number one strategy for most hunters is going to be focusing on food. Again, if you're targeting bucks, those bucks need to build up those fat reserves before winter. And if you're focusing on does have a pretty standard bedding to feeding pattern that you can kind of pattern pretty quickly. So they'll kind of be both on that same pattern. So late season is a great opportunity to focus on food, particularly because as you get later in the year, there's obviously less food available on the landscape. And so in areas that still have abundant food, a lot of times you're going to see, you're not going to see one or two deer kind of feeding in a field this time of year. Usually in December and January and into late season, when you find an active feeding location, you can see up to 26, 28 deer in a single field all feeding together. And again, that's just because of the availability of food left in the landscape. But during late season, I particularly like to focus on weather patterns. For those of you who've lived in Illinois for any length of time, we get kind of cold spells in December and January. We might get a week of nice and warm weather. Those changing weather patterns really stimulate deer activity on the landscape. And so during the late season, I'm really focused on watching for those patterns. If it's been blistering cold for 5 or 6 days and you have a warm day, that warm day is the day that I want to be out in the woods. And the same is kind of in effect in reverse. If it's really warm for maybe 5 or 6 days and then you have a real cool cold front come through, I'm going to try to be out on that odd day. Those changing weather patterns really stimulate deer activity in the late season. Another thing to focus on is try to look for snow events. Snow events are really advantageous in late season because you essentially can get a snapshot of up-to-date deer activity. As anybody knows who's tried to scout in the past few weeks prior to this week, it's been dry in Illinois for several weeks. So it's oftentimes difficult to be able to distinguish fresh sign versus older sign. The nice thing about a snow event is it's going to tell you exactly what was occurring essentially the day before. And so I always try to focus a late season hunt right after a nice snow event. And I might even turn that into a scouting trip where I'm just going to go and try to find out where these deer are feeding. And typically when you find where these deer are feeding in late season, especially if it's a snow event, you're going to see it looks like a football field out there. It looks like they've just been pawing and digging at the snow and getting underneath it, looking for acorns, looking for leftover corn. And so that's the kind of things I'm really focused in late season. And another thing that I particularly try to avoid is hunting in the mornings during late season. It can be productive for some, but what you'll find of the majority of hunters in the late season, again, we're hunting that bed to feeding pattern. And that pattern really occurs in the evening. So typically a deer is going to be sleeping during the day. They're going to get up out of their bed and start transitioning to feeding right in kind of those last few hours of the day. And so that's the pattern we're really trying to focus on for this late season.
Hey, Dan.
Yes.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yep.
So if a deer is cold, is it going to want to move more or is it going to want to stay in its bed and be all curled up?
That's a great question. And it's one of those that seems to really depend on that specific animal and how it's feeling. What I really like to focus on those particularly really cold days is I'm going to look on south-facing slopes. These are slopes that get a lot more sunlight, so they're typically going to be a lot warmer. And does in particular are going to be looking for these bedding sites that have adequate sunlight so that they can essentially warm themselves. And so that's what I'm really looking for if I'm trying to pinpoint a bedding pattern in late season. But again, I'm really focused on that feeding pattern. So where they bed kind of in relation to themselves isn't so important, But it is important to remember the south side of slopes and also big cedar thickets that allow them to get out of the wind. If it's a real cold and windy day, that can certainly impact where they bed as well. So now we're going to really dive into how to use calls. Calls are one of those things that if you use them correctly, they can be extremely effective. But if you use them incorrectly, it can ruin a hunt pretty quickly. And I will give a quick warning before I forget. On the next few slides, we will be playing some of these vocalizations. So just kind of a quick headphone warning that you may want to turn down your volume just a hair if my voice is already somewhat loud. So just a heads up for that. But when we think about calling for deer, it's important to remember that deer are fairly vocal species. Most people, when you think of vocal species, deer probably isn't one of the first things that comes to mind, but they are a somewhat vocal species. And so there's a couple different schools of thought about how to essentially use these vocalizations against them. We kind of have two schools of thought. We have blind calling. So that essentially means maybe you're just not seeing any deer activity and you're just kind of calling into the void and hoping that there's a deer out there that happens to hear it and starts coming in. This targeted calling approach, you can view it as you see a specific deer and maybe it's a buck and he's just skirting your area, maybe 60 yards, but you need to get him a little bit closer. And so oftentimes a targeted calling, you're calling at that individual deer and trying to get a response out of that specific animal, where blind calling again is just kind of calling into the void. Now, me personally, I very rarely blind call. And I'll give you my reasons, and then you can kind of make up for yourself whether you think that blind calling is something you're going to try. But when I'm hunting, I want to be the hunter. And if you start blind calling, a lot of times you're letting deer know that there's something there and there's something that might not sound right. There's something that might not smell right. You're essentially giving them kind of a leg up on where your location is. Particularly, deer are extremely, extremely good at hiding. If you've ever been in the woods and you've heard a squirrel walk, it sounds like a herd of buffaloes walking through the leaves. But a 225-pound deer, he can sneak up 5 feet behind you and you'll never once hear him. And so a lot of times when people try blind calling, there might be a deer that's already, either coming their way or maybe just outside of range that they just don't happen to see. And they're essentially letting that deer know that, hey, I'm here, and you're kind of giving away your presence. I personally prefer to use a more targeted approach. If I see a deer and it's just not coming in or it's kind of outskirting, then I might try a targeted calling approach to try to lure that animal in a little bit closer. Now, the best time to utilize calls for white-tailed deer is pre-rut until about the end of rut. So you can think of that as October 15th through about the end of November. And I'm going to skew a lot of my calling efforts towards the earlier part of that. I'm trying to think of the best way to say this, but essentially, so I hunt public land exclusively. And so one thing you'll notice a lot on public land is there's a lot of people calling often. Particularly as you get closer to rut, you'll hear calls kind of all over. Everybody's trying them, everyone's using them. So oftentimes just being silent can pay off. And most people, they start calling real heavily that first week in November. But I personally have gotten a lot more response in those that last week in October into the first week in November is a really good time to call. That's the time when, again, that testosterone level is starting to increase in the bucks. So they're starting to get that sex drive. And so you can start to use those calls basically against them. So the first call we're going to use is a deer blow / snort. And again, headphone warning, this one is a little bit loud. Go ahead and play it, Jason. Perfect. And so anybody who spent kind of a lengthy amount of time in the woods has likely heard this, especially if you've been out in the woods at night. And so this is essentially an alarm vocalization. It's essentially a deer telling other deer, hey, something's not safe here. I either see, smell, hear something that just doesn't look right. Now, when you hear it and as you're hunting, it's kind of one of those, oh crap, this hunt's over. Particularly if it's a female, so a doe, they have this really annoying tendency to snort and then run about 60 to 70 yards away from you, just outside of range, and stare at you and just snort over and over and over again. And so oftentimes that could kind of spell the end of a hunt. But again, use that as a learning opportunity. There's something that gave you away to that specific animal, and you can try to figure out where you went wrong. But there's a few kind of things you're going to see before a deer will start to snort. Typically, they're going to either see or hear you, and if they happen to see you, they're going to start stomping their feet hard on the ground, and you'll hear a big thump. And what they're doing is trying to get you to move. So again, they've kind of realized you're something weird, and they're trying to get you to move. And so they'll start to stomp and kind of shift their head side to side, just trying to get a better eye on what's there. And so typically when you see that, it's going to be followed up by this snort call. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the hunt is over, but it is kind of, again, an alarm call to the other deer in the area that, hey, something's up, and kind of stay away. And we had a question to play the call again. So we'll go ahead and play that before we move on to the next one. And I will tell you, when you're walking through the woods at 4 o'clock in the morning in the pitch black and you hear that sound, it will startle you. So just, if you've never experienced that sound, just kind of be prepared for it, that it will kind of get your heart rate up and it will startle you. But again, it's just a deer. Up next is the grunt call. And so this call is by far the most widely used vocalization by hunters. You can hear it's just this deep guttural kind of grungy sound. Now, most people will swear up and down that only bucks will make grunts, but that's not true. Both bucks and does can make grunts. Now, the call we just played for you is a buck grunt. A doe grunt, you'll hear it in a second, but it's much more nasally and high pitched. And they kind of use grunts for several different, let's just say, communication styles. You'll hear kind of the grunt that we just played. That's kind of a more establishing social hierarchy grunt. It's a very social grunt. Typically, you're going to see a buck doing that when he's next to another buck and they're getting ready to kind of get angry at each other and perhaps fight. That's the kind of grunt you'll hear. Now, typically when I'm hunting, I'm going to do a very short burst that sounds, so I'll try to mimic it with my mouth, but forgive me if it's awful. And so it's essentially just these real short bursts. And so essentially that is trying to mimic when a buck is actively chasing a doe, he is going to be grunting just about every single time his foot hits the ground. It's just this constant as he's running. And so that's a lot of times what I'm trying to mimic with my grunt calling, is that there's a buck over here harassing a doe, and you're trying to elicit a response from another buck that thinks he's the dominant or the mature buck in that area, and he thinks he has the right to breed that doe, and you're hoping he comes over and tries to scare off this doe or this buck that you're pretending to be. And so grunt calls are very effective for that, particularly if you have a deer that you can already see. Give it a grunt call. Just give it a quick little and see how he reacts. A lot of times the deer is going to tell you how they're reacting to the call. And again, this is why I really like that targeted calling approach rather than the blind calling style. Is I want to see how that animal's reacting to the calls. Now, if that buck immediately turns and faces you, put the call away and get your either firearm or bow up, because chances are he's going to come in and be ready to go. More often than not, you'll kind of see them perk their ear. Again, they kind of have free flexibility to rotate their ears independently. And so you might see an ear rotate and just kind of face you as he continues to do his own thing, whether it's walking or feeding. If I see one of those ears turn and face me, again, that lets me know he's listening or he heard it. And so again, I might add a few more of those short, just just to try to get that response a little bit more. Now, if he continues to walk away, a lot of people will just continue to grunt at him over and over and over. All you're doing is essentially educating that deer to not only your grunt call, but also to your presence and to your location. And so if that deer in particular starts acting like, yeah, I'm not very interested, I'm just going to continue eating or continue walking on this trail, that's just the way hunting is, and just kind of let that one go. Don't continually call at them. Again, eventually that deer will pinpoint exactly where you are in that tree. Excuse me. That's one thing deer are very good at, is pinpointing a location where the sound comes from. And again, the more opportunity you give them to do that just by continually calling, the better they're going to be at it. So typically, I'm just going to watch his reaction. If he looks really interested in that sound, I'm going to keep doing it until he makes a decision to come or makes a decision to leave. But it's really important to watch that body language as you use these calls. Up next is the Estrous Bleat. And so that specific vocalization is what a real doe bleat sounds like. And most people, if you've been in the hunting industry for about 10 years, you've probably remember when these can style calls came on the market. They're essentially, we all had those kind of rain tubes as a kid that you tilt up, down, and it has the little slider on the inside that slides and make noise. These are essentially the same thing. Now, the big challenge about estrus bleats is knowing what they actually mean. The real important factor to remember is that the intensity of this specific vocalization of the doe bleat is going to depend on how long that specific doe has been in heat. So essentially this call is a doe saying, hey, I'm ready to breed, nobody's bred me, come breed me. And the longer she's in heat without being bred, the more, not desperate, but the longer and the volume all increases on this call. And these can calls are essentially made to mimic that very extreme end of this bleat. And so typically I'm not a huge fan of these calls because that's something that a lot of people, in my opinion, overuse in the woods. And I think deer have started to become a little bit more accustomed to it. When they first came on the market, it was one of those things that just took the industry by storm. Nobody really was able to mimic the sound before, so it was very productive in a hunting setting. But as it's becoming more prominent in the industry and more people are using it, it's kind of lost that effect. It still can be very advantageous. However, I typically don't utilize a doe bleat by itself. It works really good in collaboration with a grunt call or with maybe a rattling sequence that we'll get to, or some of these other vocalizations. I like to use it to add a little bit more realism to the calling kind of song I'm singing, I guess, for lack of a better term, but I don't kind of use it solo. It can be effective. It can be effective. The nice thing about the doe call is it can be effective at getting other does as well. The buck calls like grunt, rattling, you're typically not calling for does in those cases. However, a doe will occasionally come into these estrus calls. Up next, we have the snort wheeze call. Can you play it one more time? It's pretty short. Perfect. So this is arguably one of my favorite calls to work in collaboration with a grunt call. If you look at this picture here in the bottom left, this is kind of what a lot of the grunt calls on the market are starting to turn into these days. But if you look at this top part where Jason's kind of highlighting his mouse cursor, that's essentially a snort wheeze call built into a lot of these grunt calls. And so you're basically getting kind of a 2-in-1. Now, the challenge with a snort wheeze call is it's not very loud and it's not a sound that carries a long distance. And so that's why I really like to tie it in with a grunt call, because a grunt call has that deep sound that tends to carry a little bit more in either a windy situation or maybe you have a lot of terrain. It's just a sound that carries a little bit more. So the grunt call can be absolutely fantastic to get a deer's attention. And now that deer's attention is perked, he's spending, he's shifted his ears to you, he's paying more attention. Then you can use a snort wheeze, which he's more likely to hear because he's now paying attention rather than crunching on acorns or chasing deer or things like that. So it works really well in kind of conjunction with a grunt call. It is a very nasally sound. Typically, you're not going to call up young bucks. So this is a kind of a very territorial call. Typically, when they're making this call, they're kind of face to face with another buck, and they're getting ready to start fighting. And so if you start to use a lot of these calls, that's something to keep in mind, is that oftentimes young deer are not going to come into them because A, they know they're not dominant in that area, or B, they may have already gotten their butt whooped by a big deer in that area. So oftentimes you're not going to be calling a lot of young deer. Now, I will make the caveat, young deer will occasionally come into these calls more curious, but they typically will stay 100 or 200 yards away and just kind of stare, just kind of see what's going on rather than come in directly to the call and say, hey, this is my spot, I'm ready to fight. They're a lot more curious than the older mature bucks. Now we get to rattling. So this is one of the calls that when it works, it's like something out of a movie. It's one of the coolest experiences if you ever get to be a part of a hunt that has a real good rattling response. It's one of those things you'll never forget. So essentially a rattle call is you're mimicking two deer fighting. Now in this specific case, I prefer to use kind of a rattling sequence instead of just rattling alone. Again, I like to mix different vocalizations together just to make it seem a little bit more realistic. And you will hear that through this recording as well. And so that's kind of your basic rattling sequence. And again, rattling is one of those things that when it works, it's great, but when it doesn't, you're again letting every deer know where you are because it's a loud sound, but you are trying to mimic two deer fighting. And I saw we have a question from Mike. That's a great question, is when should you rattle? So typically, I personally do not like to rattle very much during peak rut. Again, peak rut, you're starting to see a lot of does coming into estrus at the same time. So the bucks aren't near as dependent on a single doe to breed. There's a lot more options essentially out there. And so I like to do a lot of my rattling. I basically start it the day before Halloween, and I might go through maybe the first weekend in November is when I've had really good success with rattling. After that, again, the bucks aren't necessarily as focused on territory. They're not as focused on trying to find and beat off that buck because he's with a doe. There's plenty of does out there, and they're already probably likely either tending a doe or chasing one or actively breeding. So I like to rattle a lot in kind of late October, early November. As rut starts to take hold, I put my rattling stuff away. But the cool thing about rattling is you can do it in a couple different ways. You can either use real antlers, whether it's from a deer that you either harvested or maybe it's sheds that you found, or you can even do it with some of these rattling bags like you see in this picture. It's essentially a cloth bag that's full of wooden dowel rods. So you just kind of slap it between your hands and kind of roll it around, and it'll kind of mimic that same sound. Now, you'll never get the right tonality and sound of real antlers using some of these different tools. But the nice thing is those rattling bags, they're a lot smaller, they're easy to carry and easy to handle. But nothing will kind of beat the sound of real antlers kind of clanking together. Now, when I recommend rattling, I really like to highlight how it sounds when you're actually hearing two deer fighting. If you've ever watched a lot of these hunting shows, when they're doing rattling, they're just kind of up in their tree, hitting two things together. And then if you were to watch a real deer fight take over, it sounds, again, like a football game out there. They're smacking the ground. They're running into trees, running into bushes. And so if I want to elicit a very active response, and I think there's a real mature deer in an area, and I think he's going to respond to rattling, oftentimes I'll sit on the ground so that I can pound on the ground, so I can pound on trees, and just make that whole scene a little bit more realistic. And so we had a few questions. I'll get to both of those in just a second. So again, the big thing with rattling is even more so than kind of snort, wheeze, or grunt calls, is that rattling is going to deter a lot of young bucks. Now you'll have young bucks come in to the area, but again, they're going to stay 200 yards out. They're kind of like the freshmen at high school. When there's a fight going on, they always kind of come around and watch. The younger bucks will kind of have that same response. They're not going to go to where that call was, but they'll kind of come in to where they are, or where they can kind of watch. So I'll start working through some of these questions really quick. How important is calling as a part of your overall strategy? How important during archery season versus shotgun season? Great question. And again, a lot of it really depends on what the deer activity is. And that's one of my biggest proponents of this whole kind of hunt, what I call hunt planning, is spend the time to understand what the deer are actively doing. If the deer are, for some reason, they're feeding heavily, like last year, for instance, we had a real late harvest, so there was a lot of standing crops left in the woods. That's going to impact how I call and how I use calls, just because those deer are going to be living in different areas than they typically are. Typically, I don't really utilize calling as kind of a part of my hunt planning. It's just another tool that I have in my pocket to use whenever I want to. But again, I personally don't like to do much blind calling. I don't want to just call into the void and hope something hears it. I'm personally calling when I happen to see a deer and it's just not coming in, or it's just kind of skirting by. I have a question from Jake. Is it better to use antlers from two different deer for the right tonality? Oh, that's an interesting question. I've never really considered that. Typically, I use two sheds that I found that were on they're both 4 points, but they're really uniform and kind of straightforward, so that when you clang them together, you don't smack your fingers. That's one of the real problems about using real antlers, is those tines, obviously. And you will inevitably, as your hands are cold and you're clanking them together, you're going to smack your hand one of those times. So these rattle bags are really good for that. But I've never really considered using two different antlers. That's an interesting thought process. We have a question from Ed. How hard is it to pick up one of these off-the-shelf calling solutions and actually achieve success with it? Do they tend to be idiot-proof? That's a fantastic question, and that is the nicest thing about deer calls. If you look at duck calls, if you look at turkey calls, elk, the majority of other species out there, goose, there's a learning curve for utilizing and making the correct sounds. You're still going to have to learn when to use them, but the nice thing about deer calls, a lot of them are simply you're just blowing air through them, where a lot of the other calling types like deer and turkey, or not deer, but turkey and elk and things like this that have a higher pitch sound, there's a learning curve to using and creating the right vocalizations. With deer, it's basically blowing through a tube. For the grunt call, for the doe bleat, you can either buy a grunt tube that looks just like these here in the picture that are made to be doe grunt tubes, or you can buy one of the cans where you literally just flip it over and it makes the sound. So they're pretty idiot proof to get the correct sounds out of those calls. And one of the more important aspects of calling is understanding wind direction. I've blown more hunts than I care to admit because I wasn't paying attention to the wind direction. When deer hear sounds, they are typically going to try to get downwind of where they think that sound came from. And so it's important to remember when you're calling, more often than not, that deer is going to try to circle and get downwind of you so he can smell what is in that area. So it's really important to control your scent, pay attention to the wind direction, but also try to eliminate as much scent as much as possible. And so I'm going to turn it over to Adam really quickly, and he's going to basically do a deep dive into scent control strategies and kind of give us some real applicable tools that we can use while we're out there. Oh, I got a call from Ed, or another question from Ed. Great question, Ed. Are there any rules in regard to using calls? Great question. So electronic calls are allowed for deer, but they are not for any other species. Go ahead, Adam.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, so first off, we're going to be talking about kind of camo storage and equipment storage. Storing your camo and your gear in plastic totes, kind of like what you see here on the right, reduces the chance of odor molecules clinging to your clothing. Hard plastic works great for that. It's pretty impermeable. So if you keep it in a damp basement or kind of in your garage, and you keep your car and lawnmower in there, it's kind of going to keep all those scents out of the box that you keep them in. They're also nice if you have a bigger car or truck. You can kind of just keep those in the back of your truck and just have them with you at all times during hunting season. So you're always kind of ready to go, and you can just slide it out and get everything ready once you get to the field. And again, like I said, it keeps moistures and odors out very well. So kind of a different style of storage here, some soft-sided bags. There's super fancy bags out there like the Scent Crusher one here. It has technology that basically eliminates all the odors in the bag, and you kind of have to plug it in and charge it. These are nice because they're pretty large and you can fit a lot of stuff in them, and you can get your boots scent free, your clothes, it can all fit in there, and it works pretty nice, but they are pretty expensive. There are inexpensive ones like this plain just kind of scent safe bag here on the bottom picture. Acts the same if you do a bunch of your scent elimination prior to hunting season and just keep your stuff in there so no other scent gets added to that. You can do it that way as well, and those are a lot more inexpensive, and again, nice to keep in your car, kind of keep your gear ready to go. So now we're going to be talking about cover scent. Now this is not scent elimination. This is kind of just an additional step you can take to trying to eliminate your scent. You can put some cedar branches or pine branches in your totes, in your plastic totes or in your bags, depending on how you store it. You can use these scent wafers. I kind of like those. You can find those at Walmart. They do have a pretty strong scent to them. Basically smells like dirt in my opinion. And I just toss one in my tote and in my backpack to just kind of keep a cover scent on them. And you can also use these dryer sheets. Now, again, this isn't to eliminate your scent. This is just to kind of mask it over. I don't have time to wash my hunting clothes and some of my gear every time after I hunt. So this is nice to just kind of have that extra layer of protection. But again, it does not eliminate all your scent. It just kind of masks it over. But it does work pretty good in addition to scent elimination products. So now scent elimination products, you guys can see this picture right here, kind of gives you basically everything that you can buy nowadays that has scent elimination in it. You have your regular spray, you have talcum powder, you have deodorant, you have shampoo, you have laundry detergent. They kind of make everything. It's really up to you on how much you want to play into it. Some people love using this stuff and they swear by it. Some people don't use any of it at all. I always kind of tell the story of a older gentleman I met in Wisconsin who hunts some public land right next to my friend's place. He's super traditional. He gets up in the stand about 10 foot off the ground, wears his jean jacket and jeans every single time he's out there, smokes a pack of cigarettes with his handmade bow and handmade arrows, and always has success. So it kind of all, depends on how deep you want to dive into this. I do use some of it, and I know Dan and Jason have tried it before as well. It kind of just plays into your confidence as well. Just that extra layer of protection. And, it might give you that added boost of confidence to know that you're walking into a good deer spot and that they can't smell you. But again, they make all sorts of stuff. There's all sorts of companies. This is just one right here. They do make like sample kits as well, so you guys can buy like a little kit for about 20 bucks that has a little bit of everything to try out. So again, kind of do your research on that, see what you guys would like to purchase if you do or don't, and play it that way. So now we're going to be talking about scent lures. So a little bit different scent, where this is going to be focusing on deer scents and when and where to use them. So when to use scent lures, it's similar to calling. You're going to want to use these in late October until mid to end November when bucks are more aggressive. And you're going to want to use these over scrapes. So this deer in this picture right here is standing under a scrape tree. He's licking that branch right there. And if you guys were to be able to walk up to where this deer is standing, there's going to be a little kind of bared spot in the ground. Again, like Dan mentioned before, it's kind of like there's a communication station. So you're going to want to use them next to scrapes. You're going to want to use them on a drag line. A drag line is basically, they sell them. You can kind of fab up your own at home. I have used just an old shoelace or an old piece of paracord or something and tied up an old dish rag to the end of it and stuck it under the lace of my boot, and you kind of just drag it along behind you to your stand, and it leaves that scent on the ground as you walk. And then you can also set them up around your location once you get there as well. So now this is the deer scent lure page. We're going to be talking about all these. Again, as you can see, if we wanted to, we could have made 10 slides about how many different products there are, because really there are so many out there. But I just kind of condensed the few main ones here that you guys will see in stores. But there are doe estrus scents, buck and rut scents, and calming scents. So we'll kind of start with the top left one here and explain from there. So buck bomb is a pretty readily available one that you guys will probably see cans in the woods. Unfortunately, people leave them behind. If you do use this, please pick up your cans after you're done with them. But basically, it's just a spray can of doe estrus. So you can spray it in a scrape. You can spray it kind of on a few bushes around you, kind of, just mask the area around you if you'd like. And it is nice and convenient that it is in a spray can. You see the same in the bottom right picture here of the gentleman holding that little glass tin. That's the same stuff right there, but it is a lot less messy in the spray bottle. So if you do decide to use something like that, the spray bottle is a pretty good option to go with, just because you do have that cap, and it works out pretty nice. Moving on to the right is the smoking sticks. So basically, these are like incense. You light the end of it, and it has the same scent as the doe estrus, and the smoke goes with the wind. So theoretically, the way it's supposed to work is the wind is blowing towards the deer where you think the deer might be, and that deer is supposed to smell it in the air and come down that line of smoke and that scent right towards your stand. I believe Jason has used these in the past, and he said that they've worked pretty good. So just another option out there for you. And again, to the bottom of that, with that gentleman holding that little...
Adam, I'm going to jump in for a sec, just on these smoking sticks. I just would feel remiss if I didn't mention, with a lot of the wildfires occurring out west, it's obviously fire is a real danger when you're using some of these things. So if you are using smoking sticks, just please do it in a very safe way, in a very safe manner. That's all I'll say.
Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you, Dan. But yeah, so moving on to this gentleman here in the bottom right. Again, this is going to be the same scent. You can get this in doe estrus in a little tin like that, or buck and rut scents. And basically, you're supposed to dip these kind of wicks that you see here on the left. You can dip these wicks in there, and basically those get drenched and saturated, and they drip scent into a scrape or onto a trail that you're sitting next to. ever so often. Again, watch out with these. They are usually glass and they can break, and that is a very messy situation if that does happen to you. So make sure to keep those in like a plastic Ziploc or something like that, at least, to have a little bit extra protection so your gear doesn't get covered in that scent. The one to the left, Evercalm, kind of interesting. These came out on the market a few years back. It looks like a deodorant stick. Again, I think they're just trying to get into less messy products. They do work pretty nice just because you can, it works just like a deodorant stick. You can kind of just put it on your boots. That's mainly what I use that one for. It's a calming scent, so I put it on my boots for when I walk in and out of areas, just to try to eliminate kind of my ground scent. I usually try not to use a lot of the other scents. I like to play the wind, as Dan mentioned before, and kind of just, try to keep it natural. But this stuff I do like to use just so my boots don't make a bunch of scent on the ground. And if deer were to cross my tracks, I might have a chance of them not smelling me. So that's kind of what that Evercalm is right there. And that is readily available as well at any sporting goods store. So now moving on to the kinds of deer stands that you guys will encounter. This right here is kind of your basic stand that you guys have, I'm sure, all seen in a catalog or on TV or something like that. Just your basic ladder stand. These are usually your most inexpensive. They can allow for multiple people to hunt together. Usually you can find them pretty readily available in a two-seater. So if you have, a young one you want to take hunting, or if you have somebody that just wants to come and watch and kind of learn the ropes, that's a good way to do it. They are pretty semi-permanent. They are kind of a pain in the butt to set up and down. Generally, you'll see these more on private land where, you can leave stands up whenever you want, as long as it's your place or you have the permission, of course. Not many IDNR sites have these, but there are a few in the state. Up next is the climber tree stand. These are one of the more portable stands, pretty popular with people who hunt public land. It's a two-part stand. You can climb up pretty high. Basically, if you look at the picture here of the gentleman on the bottom left, it's almost like doing an ab workout up and down the tree. You kind of shimmy, you bring your top piece up, you lock it into the bark of the tree, then you kind of bring your knees up and move the bottom part, step down with your weight, and you basically do ab crunches all the way up and down the tree. It is kind of a workout, and if you guys are getting into hunting on public land and are wanting to use a climber, make sure to practice this, please, beforehand, so you're not trying to do this in the dark the first day. They can be a little bit bulky, and the downfall is you do need a straight tree. If there's any branches or limbs in your way, there is no really good way to go around them unless you unhook the cables, which is very dangerous. So please do not try that. So again, yeah, you do need a straight tree to use these effectively. And again, you do need a safety line and a harness. Those are required for safety purposes. Please don't use any sort of stand without a safety line or harness because that can definitely lead to injury. And I'm going to push that through almost every slide here. Very important.
And just a quick reminder, every tree stand that you buy brand new from the store is required by law to have some kind of harness with it if it's a complete stand. Typically, those are fairly cheap, but they also come with DVDs that again are required by law, but they show you how to use those harnesses. So if you do buy a new tree stand, look out for those in the box. Don't just throw them away. Go ahead and watch those videos. They are very informative.
Yes, definitely worth a watch for any new hunter. So moving on to the next kind of stand, the hang and hunt tree stand. These are very versatile. You can hang these in just about any kind of tree. It doesn't have to be the straightest tree, and it can have limbs. The one kind of downfall to the stand is that it does require an extra set of kind of equipment. It does need sticks because you need something to, go up the tree with. So yes, here's what sticks look like when they're set up on the tree on the top picture. This is kind of the bottom picture. That's what it looks like when you have your sticks attached to your stand when you're ready to carry. Some people carry them just in their hand. Some people mount them to their stands when they have them on their back. That's totally up to you. But generally, you're going to need at least 3 to 4 sticks. Again, depends totally on the spot. You might get away with 2. But generally, if you want to get into that kind of 15 to 18 foot range, you're going to need about 3 or 4 sticks to get up the tree. Again, for this, you might need an extra piece of equipment also, a climber's rope or a lineman's rope. This allows you to be attached to the tree while you're setting up the sticks. And basically it attaches around the tree onto your harness so that you can lean back into your harness, put all your weight into the harness so you can leave your hands free to set up the sticks as you go up the tree. So again, it's just another piece of safety equipment that you better make sure that this either stand comes with or you do want to buy separately. And again, of course, you do need a harness with that as well. Up next is the tree saddle. This has been kind of the way of hunting that's been getting pretty popular. This used to be a way people hunted a lot, and kind of it's been getting brought back into the hunting world. People have made new tree saddles, and that's kind of why they've grown in popularity. But they're the easiest to carry in and out because basically you're just sitting in a glorified tree harness. You do need a few sticks to climb up the tree to get high. And then you have this little platform that you can attach to the tree to kind of put your feet on. And then you wrap a safety rope around the tree, and that attaches to your harness. And the nice thing about these is that you're able to kind of shoot 360 around the tree. You're not, stuck to a stand where you have to stand on the platform or sit on the seat. You can kind of swing around slowly around the tree and really get a shot on anything in your vicinity without the tree being in your way. So these are, again, they're getting super popular. They are a little bit pricey right now. I'm sure in the next couple of years that once people start buying them, they will make a little bit more affordable ones, but they are pretty cool. And if that's something that interests you, better check them out. So some more safety tips. Again, always wear a safety harness. Ensure that the tree is still alive before you climb into it. Select the properly sized tree for your stand. Do not climb up with your bow or firearm. Please use a haul line for all of your gear. Always keep your hands and your feet free to do the climbing up the ladder or with your stand. Leave all your stuff on the ground, tie up a line, put it through your belt loop, and then you can just haul it up once you're set in your stand. If you try to do it all at once, that just turns into a big mess. So please do that. And please don't screw anything in the trees on public land. Again, we don't want to be ruining any of our resources. And again, practice using your tree stand in the off season in broad daylight so you get comfortable with it. And next is the ground blind. So these are pretty easy to carry in and out. Some of them you can probably even stick into a backpack. They some can be big and bulky depending on kind of what you get, the size. If you just get a 1-person versus a 2-person one or bigger, they are fairly easy to set up. And if you are going to be using these on public land, most of the time, again, you're going to have to take them in and out daily. Again, there's very few sites in Illinois that will let you leave those up all year round. So if you are taking them in and out daily, please brush in your blinds really well. It's going to make it a lot more effective for you. Just use some dead sticks and branches around your area that you're hunting. Again, just because deer won't be used to seeing that sitting there, usually kind of a good rule of thumb, if you have the ability to, that you leave your blind up about a month before you hunt in the area. That way the deer kind of get acclimated to it and they know it's not dangerous. But if you can't do that, then you better try and hide it pretty good so things don't notice it, or animals don't notice it as much. And then another option is hunting on the ground. You can be very successful with hunting on the ground. You can use natural elements to make your blinds. So again, you can just kind of sit in a downfall and use some branches and stuff to make a little hide for yourself. Sit with your back square against whatever your background is, so you don't get silhouetted, and you don't have light or something coming back from your background, so things can see you better. And you are a lot more mobile with this. If you notice that you're sitting in the corner of the field and you notice that deer are coming out of a different side of the field, you have that ability to try and put the sneak on them, or, hop back into the woods and kind of try a different approach and change your setup. You're not stuck to sitting in a blind or sitting in a tree. You can be pretty versatile and walk around even if you'd like. And on the bottom here, we have Jason with 2 deer, I believe, in 5 minutes last year on the ground. So it definitely works. And yeah, better give that a try if that's interesting to you.
I would say 20 minutes. Okay. I shot the doe first, and then we were giving her some time. And then the spike came up, and I had a very restricted hunting season last year, so I was trying to fill the freezer up. So I got him after that. And I tell you, I do regret having to drag 2 deer out about a mile in on public. I know some people go elk hunting and stuff, but that was pretty rough for me. But I had a friend. I had a buddy with me, so that was helpful. Just real quick, I know Dan has answered a little bit there, but you guys want to talk real quick about which one of these methods you prefer, like between tree stand and hang on the ground?
I'll hop in real quick and give my few cents. Growing up, I was exclusively a tree stand hunter, primarily a climbing tree stand hunter. That was just kind of how I was taught, and that was just the way my dad did it, my grandpa, and that's the way I learned. But as I've started to kind of develop my own hunting style, I'm kind of more of a minimalist in a lot of ways. And the tree stand, like a lot of people have kind of mentioned in this chat already, it's very cumbersome. It can be extremely loud, and it can be a safety concern for some. So last year and the year prior, I decided I was going to devote all my bow hunting efforts to just hunting from the ground. And while I will admit it's a lot more, I shouldn't say it's a lot more difficult. There are new challenges that I didn't expect. Like I kind of just typed in the chat, something as simple as when you first get to the spot where you're going to sit on the ground, brush away all the leaves and sticks so you just have a big pile of bare dirt there so that you can sit there and any little movement you make is basically silent. All it takes is one stick or one leaf for a deer to kind of hear something, whip their head really fast and look right at you. But the more important part when you're hunting on the ground, particularly if you're bow hunting, is when to draw your bow. So what I like to do is I'll try to kind of brush myself in a little bit, but I try to find areas that I know I will have a natural way to draw the bow. So if they're walking on a trail kind of horizontal or parallel in front of me, I'm going to wait until their head gets blocked by a tree. And so it's just these little things that you really need to pay that much more attention to when you're on the ground. But with archery equipment, if you're using a traditional bow that you have to draw back with your arms, it is going to add some added challenges. But you may personally think those challenges are worth more than lugging around a 20 or 30 pound tree stand for a half mile or so. So that's kind of my 2 cents. Again, it just kind of depends on the individual. Again, I've had success on the ground, and that's probably the way I'm going to continue to hunt this year. One of the big things for me is it allows me to hunt a lot more ground. I saw somebody kind of jokingly in the chat a few minutes ago mention, "Oh, we have straight trees in Illinois," but that's really true, especially if you're looking to use a climber stand. You have to have a very specific tree that you're looking for to hang your stand in. And so a lot of times the areas that I want to hunt for one reason or another don't have a tree that's suitable to hang stands in. And so being able to be mobile and be on the ground allows you to hunt a lot more places that most people who are really stuck on the kind of tree stand mindset that they don't really get to spend time in. So that's kind of my 2 cents.
Great. Yeah, I would agree. I've probably killed half my deer out of a tree stand and half the deer on the ground. Just a mixture of what I was doing and which property I was hunting on. I'm from Pennsylvania, so we do have straight trees back there. And I did grow up with a climbing stand that I still have. And but these 2 deer, like in the photo, I got these 2 deer last year on the ground, and it was during muzzleloader season, so that's why I was wearing my orange there. So we had like maybe maybe arm thick sticks in front of us. There was a little bit. I think Dan actually made this blind, and we hunted his spot. I'm not sure. Dan, did you make that blind that I was hunting out of?
Yes.
Yeah, so there was just a couple things there just to break us up a little bit, but really we were pretty exposed. But we were just still, and I was shoulder to shoulder with my buddy, and he's the one who took me out there because I wasn't familiar with the property, and it was public land, and he sat there and wearing orange, but deer are colorblind, so they actually see orange as brown, so that was fine. And then they walked within 20 yards of us, and we took them. So you can be totally successful on the ground. It's really whatever you want to do. And then how not to make other hunters mad. Just in general, how not to make other hunters mad. My biggest advice would be move at the obvious times. So get in there before daylight. Then you kind of play flashlight tag as you're moving through the woods. If there are a lot of hunters on the property, be looking up, not just looking down, but see if there's other hunters that are shining their light at you, and then you shine your light at them, and then you move away from them and try to give them their space. Unless you're going to a spot past them, of course, just head onto your spot and see how close you are to them. I remember in Pennsylvania growing up, first day of shotgun season, you look, the sun would rise, and you look around and see the orange through the trees. I mean, it was pretty busy. But so just move at regular times, leave the woods at regular times, leave the woods at midday. Don't go out if you're gonna be having to get to work at 7 o'clock in the morning and only sit for a half hour or something like that on public land. So leave like after 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, sit at a normal time, and that way you don't be walking up on people during the magic hours of the crepuscular deer in the mornings and the evenings is my biggest suggestion. Okay, anything else, Adam and Dan, before we move on to the next section? You guys good?
Nope.
Good.
Yep.
Cool. All right, so now we're going to talk about after the shot, and I'm going to get distracted, so I put away the chat. If any questions come up, Dan and Adam, let me know. So after the shot, you want to calm down, and there's a lot of things that are going to happen as soon as you release your arrow or pull your trigger, be it a crossbow or your gun, and you need to pay attention after you've taken that shot. Okay, so it's going to be critical in helping you find your deer after this. So things to look out for is the deer body language, which I'll go over in the next slide, and then keeping an eye on where you shot the deer at, and then seeing the last place that you see the deer run off to, and then listen to any crashing noises after the deer is out of sight to try to pinpoint the direction the deer was moving into. And then after that, you want to kind of take landmarks of the area. And one suggestion we had in a webinar a couple months ago was to take a photograph from your tree stand, so that way you can understand what you were looking at. Because when you get down on the ground and you walk away from your spot, even though you've been staring at it for a couple hours, and you turn around, look back at your stand, some people get disoriented and they can't remember exactly where they were at or anything. So it's really easy to get disoriented in the woods. So just try to get your landmarks and understand where that deer was at when you took that shot. And then you want to be patient. So you shouldn't even get down out of your tree stand. I'll go over the different times in a couple slides, but give it anywhere from a half hour to an hour, possibly even 3 or 4 hours, depending on how good of a shot you made. And you don't want to be running up there, because in this slide we say you can bump the deer, which basically means if you start following your blood trail too soon, you can scare that deer up, because their tendency is to run towards water, run towards a thicket, and lay down and try to recover. So if you are pushing them, they might have clotted up their wound at that point, and then they go to run away, and then they'll still be mortally wounded, but they won't be leaving the trail that they had before. So you really need to give them the time that they need to pass away before you start pushing in on them. That's extremely critical as you go and try to find your animal. And before I move on, I'll be talking about this in a second, but on the right-hand side here, you see this blood with bubbles in it. This is evidence of a lung shot. So if you see blood like that, that's great. That means you made a very good shot on that deer. Hopefully you double lunged it and it won't be going too far. But again, with these animals, their ability to travel after being wounded is sometimes very impressive. It's insane that they can go over 100 yards sometimes, even after a good shot. It depends on the animal. But that's what you want to see. You want to see bubbles in the blood. That is going to be indication of oxygen in the blood. That's going to be from the lung area. So really quick, we'll talk about the body language of a deer after you take a shot at it. So if you're not familiar with the deer anatomy, you're going to be aiming for the heart in the lung region. That's going to be your shot that you're going to be trying to take. This is going to be the liver, is the purple organ here, and then the stomach, intestines, and then just that back leg. So you're going to be wanting to hit in the upper part of the chest cavity there, not too far back. So with a well-placed shot, the deer is going to leap into the air, almost like you're scaring a cat kind of, and then also a mule kick would be a good sign. So it's both back legs kicking out and it running away, and also having the tail down is an indication that it's a fairly wounded deer. So that's going to be a good shot. That's what you want the deer to look like after you take that shot. Then a shot that's too far back, so you're going to be hitting the guts or the stomach, that's going to look like the deer's almost doing a push-up, almost like it's hunched up, and it's almost like a stomach punch. You can imagine if you punch a deer, like imagine what that would look like, and it would hunch up and kind of get down to the ground, and the tail would be up. So that classic white tail running away up, and that's going to be indicating that you did a gut shot. Now, that doesn't mean the animal's not going to die. It just means that you got to give that animal time to die. Unfortunately, it's just going to take a couple more hours before it passes away. And again, that's going to be the critical time to decide if you want to pursue that animal, and or sometimes the best thing is to let it go, and in this state, you are allowed to hire dogs to go and track your deer. And we have slides on how to find out that information that Dan's going to go over in a couple slides. So sometimes you don't even want to pursue your animal because you'll be putting your scent out into the woods, and that's going to throw the dogs off. So if you make a bad shot and you know you made a bad shot, just back out and try to find a tracker in your area. Okay, so then a spinal shot. So this is if the deer goes to run away, and I'm gonna be honest with you guys, you're shooting a weapon at this animal. Its front legs may only work, and its back legs may be dragging behind it. So if that happens, then that means that you hit it in the spine. Other things that could happen is if you hit it in the spine, all four legs could curl up, and then the deer could roll over. And you might think that the animal, you just dropped it, because you see that on the hunting shows a lot, especially with rifle hunting. You'll see animals go bloop and they just fall down and they're dead right there. But in this case, you're going to want to do a second shot, a follow-up shot, to try to put that animal out of its misery, because it might not be a mortal shot within a reasonable time. And they're probably right in front of you too. So I suggest doing it if you have a clean shot from the stand or from where you're at, to take a second shot from there if it's a good shot. Because I have had in the past, I know I've been on a hunting camp where my father-in-law actually went up, and he spined a deer, and he went to go shoot it. And right before he shot it, he walked up to the deer about 10 yards. And when he went to go shoot, it moved on him, and it got startled. And then he ended up not even hitting its vitals again. So it's just a mess. So if you can be stealthy about it and trying to not spook the deer and take a shot at it, if you have a clean shot, that's what I suggest doing. And then a very poorly placed shot would be a flailing limb. So again, it's something that you can see from your tree stand. If you see a deer run off and you see a leg that's just one leg that's not working or flailing, then that means that you probably put a bad shot on that deer, and then you have to make a plan about how you want to try to pursue that animal. And sometimes that might, if you're with a gun, you might just hit this bone here, and you still got a vital, hit the vitals, and it just blew that leg off there a little bit, or snapped the bone there. And you still might have made a good shot on the animal, but still you got to give that animal time before you start pursuing that still. So I'm going to reiterate again what you need to remember after you take that shot. So note the location that you shot the deer. Note the location that you saw the deer last. Listen for any crashing noises once the deer is out of sight. And then there's also a chance you can listen for any guttural moaning. So the deer, if it is passing away, may be making this noise that isn't like the calls we played earlier. It's more of almost like a sheep bang or a moan, and that means that the deer is going to be passing away. And for some people, they're excited to hear that because they know that the deer is going to die. Other people, that might bum you out because it is kind of a noise you're not used to hearing. But it does mean that the deer is going to die, so you're going to be able to recover that deer. So just keep an ear out for that. And then you're going to want to note your shooting location. So note if you're where you're at or where you're standing at or what tree stand you're in. So that way that can help you when you get down on the ground, kind of line up, okay, I was standing there, the deer was here. The whole idea is to find the blood. So but you want to find the blood before you get to the spot where you last saw the deer. So between the spot that you shot the deer and to where you last saw it, you're hoping to find the start of the blood trail at that point, because that's going to let you have the best chance of recovering that animal, because you're like, okay, here's the blood trail, I can start here, and then you can walk from there. Don't just walk out to the last spot that you saw the deer, because that's going to get you farther away from where you're at, and that's going to disorient you even more. So it's best to go as close as you can to where you were and then work your way that way. Many cases, I mean, like the doe I shot with the first doe I shot there in that photograph that I showed you guys, she went 40 yards and we can almost see her laying in the woods. So sometimes you can see them, sometimes you can't. So it really depends on what happens. And then again, I said take a photo from your stand. That might help you orient yourself when you get down to the ground. Okay, so reading an arrow. So like I said, with that leaf photograph, there's a lung shot or a heart shot. There's going to be bubbles in the arrow. Also for heart shots, it's going to be kind of a lighter color blood, but very thick, and that could be a heart shot. If it is a dark red and almost brown color, that's going to be a liver shot. So this is a graphic I got off of Google image search, honestly, but so here's 0 hours. So really it's going to give it at least a half hour, if not 45 minutes to an hour. There's no reason to be running out after your deer, so just give it its time. And then for liver shots, go 3 hours to 4 hours. And then for a gut shot, so this is going to give you some stomach content, maybe some feces or stuff like that, parts of food and everything, and it's going to smell bad. So give that at least 6 hours, if not more. And then, of course, if your arrow doesn't have anything on it, then you probably missed the animal. So once you find your blood, you're going to want to, I'm going to reiterate again. So go to the spot that you saw the deer, try to find some blood, and then move slowly and deliberately. So watch where you're putting your feet. You don't want to step. If you've made a bad shot and you're just following, sometimes you can find a deer and the first blood you see is almost like a pinhead. So watch where you're putting your feet, especially when the leaves are down and it's fall out and all the leaf color might camouflage your blood sign. One trick I saw once was someone brought hydrogen peroxide out with them. So if you saw a leaf, you didn't know if it was just a red dot on a leaf or a blood, you can take the hydrogen peroxide out and spray that onto it, and then it bubbles up just like you would a cut on your hand or something. So that shows that that's blood. So that's one way to try to help you figure this out. But you can walk out, try to find it, and then as you find it, mark where your last blood was at, and then walk deliberately forward and trying to find the next one. If you have a friend with you, then have them stand at that last spot, and then only one of you go walk out, because the more people you have trotting around, you're going to possibly step on the evidence of the blood, or you're going to be leaving too much scent in the woods for the dogs to track later on. Because sometimes you might have thought that you had a good shot, but then your blood trail stops. You might want to call the dogs anyway, but that's going to give you your best shot to recover your animal. So just some concerns with leaving your deer out overnight. So temperature-wise, everybody wants to know how hot is too hot for a deer to be sitting out overnight. You want the body temperature of that deer to be under 40 degrees. So if it's early season and it's going to get hot, you're going to want to try to find that deer that night. So to reduce the bacterial growth that's going to be happening inside the deer. Then also, if it's going to rain, you want to check that, because that might wash away your evidence to try to find that animal. So you might want to be more quickly trying to find that animal at that point. And then just something to consider is coyote activity in the area. I have come up on an animal the next day. I found a big doe probably the biggest doe I ever shot. And unfortunately, her rear end was eaten out by the coyotes overnight. They totally ate her back legs, and she wasn't coverable at that point. So we told the game warden and all that stuff, but we weren't able to eat the meat. So when a blood trail ends, it may slow down, especially if it's a muscle shot or a gut shot. It has the ability to clot a little bit quicker than the lungs or the heart or the liver, and it might slow down and end. But you can't give up, and by law you can't give up. There's law that says you have to do your best to find your animal after you shoot it, but also just responsibly, you shouldn't give up. You should try to call your buddies up, try to get a search party going, try and find this animal, because it's your responsibility. You shot it, you need to go find it. So just mark the last spot of blood, and then fan out from there, and then make a grid pattern if you have to. And again, head towards water or bedding areas, because that's going to be the areas that they're going to go. I found that the doe that ran off, I found her right next to the river that we were hunting next to. So she went right for water. And what this might look like is this little doodle here. So you can see where you found blood, last spot of blood, and then fanning out after you lost blood, trying to find more blood and or the carcass of the animal laying hopefully dead. All right, so now we're going to have Dan talk about how you can use dog trackers.
Sure, thanks, Jason. Yes, and like Jason mentioned, dog tracking, it's kind of a last resort, but it is legal on both private and public land in Illinois. And the real nice thing about dog tracking is obviously they have abilities that we as humans never will. And they are well-trained dogs, and well-trained handlers are really good at recovering deer. Now, there's a few regulations that the dog handler needs to keep in mind. And if you go through the websites that we refer you to in a minute, you will likely be with a very respectable dog handler. But as a hunter, there's really not many regulations that you need to know about dog tracking. It is legal, again, on both private and public land, but the dog does need to be leashed. Now, there's a few things to keep in mind if you are making the decision to hire a dog tracker. First of all, you are going to be hiring them. They do charge. Typically, it's not an exorbitant amount of money. I will tell a story about one time when I used one, because there's a few things to kind of remember. And the biggest one is, if you think you made a bad shot, that you think you are going to need dogs, get the heck out of there as quietly as you can. The longer that you stay in that area, like Jason mentioned, your human scent is just starting to contaminate the area. I spoke to a dog tracker a few weeks ago, and she mentioned if it's a stomach shot, so you hit that paunch, kind of if we think back to those arrows that Jason just showed, that one that had fecal matter and some stomach bile on it, those are the cases that the dogs are very successful at recovering the animal. First of all, those type of shots are nearly almost always fatal within 24 to 48 hours. So they are likely to recover that. Additionally, that stomach bile, for some reason, I could probably look up the chemistry of them at some point, but I don't really care. But essentially, that stomach bile contains some acids and some smells that seem to last a lot longer on the leaf litter. But the real challenge is that as you start tracking that animal, again, you're disturbing that site, you're putting human scent, and then it's going to start confusing the dog a little bit. So if you know you're going to have dogs come in, just back out, don't even start trailing the animal, and go ahead and call that dog tracker. Now, when you find a dog tracker, here's kind of the go-to for a lot of hunters is the United Blood Trackers. The website is unitedbloodtrackers.org, or if you just Google United Blood Trackers, it'll pop up. But there's typically a trainer or a dog handler and tracker in just about every county in the state. And there are a few counties that don't necessarily have a home handler, but there are handlers that are willing to travel to those other areas to help you. But when you first even decide that you think you're going to need a tracker, call them immediately, because typically, especially around gun season, which is kind of near rut, they are pretty much swamped. There's people calling them from all over the state and all over the county, and they're just getting bombarded with phone calls. So calling them as quick as you can often help you kind of get into their calendar and their availability, so to speak. There's a few things you need to keep in mind when you first call this individual. they're going to ask you a few questions. So you want to be cognizant of those and kind of think about them before you give them a call. The first thing they're going to ask is, how did you feel about the shot? And second of all, they'll start to ask some of those questions that Jason was addressing. What was the deer's reaction? What did it sound like? Where did it go? And a lot of these things that'll help them start to decide whether it's a track they're going to take. They again reserve the right. They will turn tracks away if they think that your answers sound like it's probably not going to be a recovery. Chances are they may not take it. But again, it's definitely worth that free phone call to see if they'll take it. And now if they do take it, they're essentially going to tell you just to get out of there and go meet them. And actually go back one slide. I thought there was one more slide. I'll tell a quick story about the time I utilized dog trackers, because I learned a lot about the process and kind of how we as hunters can make the job easier for the dogs and for the handlers. Again, first thing is get the scent contamination out of the way. So I was hunting a piece of public land 2 years ago at this point, and I rattled in a decent 8-point buck that came in. He came into about 32 yards, and I thought he was more broadside than he was. He happened to be a little bit quartering to me, which means his upper body is kind of facing me. And if you think about the anatomy of a deer, what that does is it really shields those vitals behind that front shoulder. And so it makes hitting those vitals near impossible. Now, a quartering 2 shot like that is something I normally don't take. But again, in the heat of the moment, I'm not really sure. I didn't realize he was quartering that heavy. And so what that caused is my arrow to hit that front shoulder and kind of just deflect a little bit back. And so I was able to clip the liver and mainly mostly going straight through the paunch. So I got the stomach, the intestines, and that sort of thing. And I instantly knew that I made a subpar shot, because just like Jason mentioned earlier, watching that deer's body reaction, he hunched down and he just kind of slowly walked off. And now as a bow hunter, that's one of the worst things you can see. But again, when you do see that's a good indication that you got a paunch shot. You need to give that deer several hours and try to hook up with the tracker. Now, again, at this point, I wasn't really familiar with the dog tracking process, so I waited about 4 to 5 hours before beginning to track this deer. I started on the trail. We found some decent blood. Up first, again, we knew it was a paunch shot, but we did start to find a little bit of blood here and there. But then we found something that is a telltale sign that you need to back out and give this deer more time. If you're ever tracking a deer and you find an area where that deer laid down and there's a big pool of blood and you can see where its body kind of smushed down the leaves and it was laying there and it's not there, chances are you just bumped that deer as you were tracking it. Again, you can kind of feel if there's blood and see if it's still warm and that sort of thing. But deer will clog up and clot up really, really quickly. And that's the danger about bumping a deer as you're tracking it. As he starts to clot up and then you bump him, now you have basically nothing to go on. You're just kind of out there on a whim. And so once I noticed that, that's when I decided to back out and made the call to the dog tracker. Well, at this point, we had been tracking the deer for about 2.5 hours and only made it probably 175 to 200 yards. We brought the dog out, and the dog got to that first bed that took us several hours. It got to that bed within 5 minutes. And within 15 minutes later, we had the deer recovered. So that just goes to show how good these dogs and how good the dog handlers are. And just the importance of, again, if you find a big pool of blood or an area where it looks like that deer bedded down and it's not right there, chances are when you either left the field the first time you bumped him, or what's even worse is if you were actively tracking and you just happen to bump him again. Because again, they're going to clot up and you're not going to find much. With paunch shots in general, there's not a lot of blood. There's not a lot of blood stored in the stomach. So again, it's very difficult for us as humans to track, and dogs are excellent at tracking these shots. Now, Jason's going to quickly go over field dressing deer. But first thing I want to mention is the importance of field dressing. And I think a lot of people view field dressing as basically that you're trying to just get the bacterial contamination out of the meat, which, yes, that's important. But one of the primary reasons that we field dress is what Jason mentioned earlier, talking about leaving deer lay overnight. You want that body cavity to get down to around 40 degrees. The easiest way to do that is to get all that big source of body heat from your stomach and get that out. And then that allows the animal to begin kind of rapid cooling. It also makes the deer lighter and makes it easier to drag out. But now I'm going to turn it over to Jason. He's going to quickly detail field dressing for us.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so real quick, here on the right is a butchery kit, really. It's not just a field dressing kit, but you can use these tools in field dressing. You can use, if you have a pocket knife, you can do everything with a pocket knife. Some people I've seen like to get a pocket knife that have what this is called as a gut hook, and I'll be talking about this in a second, but basically you can't mess this up. The only way you can mess it up is if you puncture the intestines or the stomach. So as long as you don't start puncturing the organs and you stay really close to the skin surface and you're very careful about what you're doing, you'll be okay. Just get whatever's in the deer out of the deer, even if it looks like Freddy Krueger attacked this thing. Just get all that organs out of there. And also do not cut yourself in the middle of this. So those are the two ways, really. So puncturing the stomach, puncturing yourself. Don't do that. So that's what gut hooks are good for. That keeps the blade close to the skin surface of the deer and without going too deep and puncturing in the organs. Another tool that could be used is a bone saw. I've also seen my father-in-law uses a hatchet, and you can use that if you're trying to separate the rib cage to get more easy access up to try to get the upper cavity cleaned out. And I'll mention that you would stop and do not go into the upper cavity if you're trying to get a mount done. You just cut up to the sternum, and then the rest is done with you reaching up into the body cavity and pulling the organs out and cutting the esophagus. So just starting off there, those are the tools that you'd be able to use. So again, finding a knife with a gut hook is nice, and finding a bone saw if you need one, or a hatchet to open up that chest cavity. So we've tried to play videos on this. We've tested it out, and it just does not work. I would rather show you guys a video of someone gutting a deer. It's more visually better at showing you how to do it. And one of the best ones that I've found online with the best production is the Meat Eater one with Steve Ranella. They, of course, have a great production company. So Steve goes and he shows you how to dress a deer, and that one's done very well. And also, the steps are very similar, but if you ask different hunters, they'll tell you 3 different ways of how to gut a deer, where to start at, and whatnot. So they'll give you all these different answers. So this is just one way of doing it. If you find another way of doing it, good on you. Again, just don't puncture the stomach and don't puncture yourself. You're good to go. Okay, so starting off, you're going to want to tag your animal before you get started. So follow your instructions on the tag, sign it, and either attach it to their leg or to their antler, and then you can start gutting your deer. So you're going to want to start between the legs, and you can make a small incision, and you're only going to be cutting the first layer of skin. So you can see here in this photograph that even after cutting the skin, you can't see the intestines or anything because there's a second layer underneath that skin that you'll get to eventually. But the first cut you're going to do is just going to be a small incision, and you're going to cut up towards the sternum of the deer. And you're going to want to keep the knife blade facing upward. So here it's down, which is fine for now, but that's a good way to accidentally puncture the stomach. I would rather see this person holding the knife blade facing up towards them and then cutting up the deer with inserting a little bit of the blade in and pulling up. Or again, if you have that gut hook, you can just put that gut hook in there and almost like a zipper, open up the deer cavity. So also you want to, before I miss the first bullet point, it's helpful to have the deer, if there's any hill near you, or you can prop up the deer body and have the legs facing downhill. That's going to help you drain the blood out of the deer as you're opening up the deer and getting the organs out of it. So gravity can help you with this process. And then again, have the knife pointing up. So then you're gonna go down between the legs, and in the Steve Ranella video, they don't have a footage of this with the photos that we took from this workshop, but you would cut down all the way down between the legs, and then you can open up the pelvic bone, and you would cut on either side. If it was a buck, on either side of the penis, or if it's a doe, you can cut around. These are actually, it's a doe with milk sacs. This must have been an early season doe. So you can cut around that and then pull it away and cut down towards the anus. And some people will actually cut through the pelvic bone, and that would help open up this leg section a lot more and help the blood come out and air out a lot more. Some people leave the pelvic bone intact, and they cut out the anus and then pull it through at the end to get the anus out. So that's 2 ways you can go about doing it. So then you would work your way back up, and you'd again cut that first layer of skin all the way up to the sternum, or if you're not making a mount, you go all the way up to the neck, and then you go back down and you would puncture that white tissue that is underneath that skin and cut that the same way. Now, as soon as you puncture that, their intestines and their stomach are going to want to expand out. So it's going to be very easy to cut that at that point, because they're kind of packed in there, and as soon as they get space, they're going to want to expand. So you're going to want to pull away that white skin and try to get a little slit in there, and then use your fingers to pull it out and to try to push down the stomach and pull up on the tissue, and then cut that tissue without puncturing the stomach. And another tip is that once you get going and you start cutting up this way, you can put your fingertip on your knife blade and have on the knife tip, not on the knife blade, have their fingertip on the knife tip, and then have the blade facing upward and then kind of cutting upward, again, protecting that point from puncturing the intestines or the stomach. So here you can see where they take their fingers and they cut between their fingers, so their fingers are being a buffer pulling up on the skin, and they're cutting towards the sternum of the deer. So there you go. And you can see that as the intestines, as he's opening up, the intestines are coming out of that opening. So then you're going to want to cut any connective tissue and the diaphragm away from the inner body cavity wall. This will free the intestines from the body cavity, and then you can reach up into the chest cavity and cut the esophagus. So there's a couple main connecting points for the deer. The one is going to be the esophagus, which you can see where they opened up the rib cavity. They cut along the one side of it. So again, you can do that with a bone saw. If you have a really sharp knife, you might be able to pull that off, or a hatchet. So that's where you cut along one side of the sternum there. And it's a lot easier to cut one side instead of going straight down the middle. So just pick one side and go up with that. And then you can cut the esophagus. If you weren't going to do that and you wanted to have a mount, this would not be cut. And then you just have to reach up in there and kind of blindly cut the esophagus. I know my dad only cut himself one time doing this. I haven't cut myself yet, but he cut himself when he was trying to get the esophagus. He nicked his finger pretty good. So be careful when you're doing that. And then the next connecting point, there's tissue all over the organs that kind of connect it to the body, but the other main one is going to be this diaphragm. So it looks like this red flap right here. And it's just a muscle that kind of holds the organs, it separates the lungs from the guts. And I usually cut that close to the ribs just to get it out of the way. And then that whole section will come out then. And then lastly is going to be the connections down by the pelvic bone and the anus that you're going to have to get rid of. So those are the main three points of connection inside the body. So again, you're going to want to cut out the anus and pull that tube through the other side. Some people will pull this, as they cut it out, they'll pull it out and they will put a zip tie around it. Some people don't feel like that's necessary. So if there's feces coming out at all and you don't want to get on your meat, you can zip tie that closed. Don't be shy. Honestly, the more you get in there and cut around that, the more easy it is to pull it out and the less you have to deal with it. So you want to almost have your whole knife go in there and clean out that tube, so that way it gets separated from the body and it's a lot less of a handful to try to mess around with it. So then after you have that, you separated all the parts from the animal and you can pull it out of the deer, and you can leave it on public land. That's totally fine. And if you're on private land, make sure you communicate with the landowner about where they want you to leave your gut pile. Mostly they get eaten up by scavengers throughout the night, and they're not there very long. So if you have a trail cam, you want to put it on, it might be interesting. You might see some interesting animals come up and scavenge off of it. So then you transport your deer out of the woods, and you would, so removing the entrails makes it a lot less heavier. So that's, again, one of the other reasons why to remove your entrails before you take it out. I highly suggest, growing up, I can't tell you how many times me and my dad just grabbed a leg and pulled a deer out of the woods, but I don't know what the heck we were thinking. Just go and buy one of these deer carts. They are worth their weight for what they're worth. They're very, very helpful to get them out of the woods, especially if you're going deep in public land now. So don't be afraid to spend money on that. So then you want to hang your deer. So if you are interested in butchering the deer yourself, you're going to want to age your deer out a little bit if the conditions are right. If you are not going to butcher your deer, you're going to take it to a deer processor and he'll hang your deer for you. And there's a couple of reasons why we do this. So the main reason, honestly, is to have your deer meat be more tender. So your deer is going to go into rigor mortis, and that's going to last for 12 to 24 hours. So that's when your deer is very stiff. And if you went and processed that deer and then put it in the freezer right away, then your meat's going to be like leather at that point. So it's not, you're basically wasting your meat because you're not going to want to eat it. So the idea of hunting is to get food that you want to consume. So by hanging your deer, and this allows it to cool down and allows rigor mortis to pass. And then they actually have natural enzymes inside their muscles that help break down the collagen, and that is what makes the meat tough. So as the longer you hang your deer, the more collagen will be broken down. So to have the right conditions to do this, you might see deer hanging in driveways or on trees or in garages as deer season goes on. Your deer meat temperature should be 34 to 37 degrees. So you might see this more in gun season than in archery season because it's a lot cooler outside. So you don't want your meat to be frozen, but again, that 40-degree mark is when bacteria really starts growing. So you don't want it to be at 40 degrees either. How long you want to hang your deer? It's going to be anywhere between 5 to 7 days is the average. The younger the deer is, the less collagen in its muscles. So you can hang that deer for 2 to 4 days. A big mature buck, you're going to want to hang him as long as you can. So 10 to 12 days, go for it. And that way his collagen won't break down. And they say that if you hang a buck that long, then he tastes just like a younger deer. So have at it. And there's really no reason to hang it head up or head down scientifically. The only thing that I can think of was that I prefer, if I'm going to skin a deer out, I prefer it to be head up. I just like to cut the skin around the neck and then pull down from there compared to skinning a deer head down. But to go back, a head down deer is going to cool off a lot quicker. So this is actually a deer from last September my brother-in-law got. This is in Ohio, and he got his in the afternoon, and it was pretty warm out, so we hung it upside down. So heat rises, so the heat in the chest cavity was coming out the hind end of it. Whereas if you were going to hang it this way, the heat's just going to rise up into the body cavity, and it might take, it might not be significant, but it's enough to, why not hang it up, head down, and let it air out and cool down. So just the thought. That's just, it's really to each his own. Okay, with that, we're going to have Dan talk a little bit about CWD.
Perfect. I actually just saw a really interesting question from Joe K pop up in the chat. And he basically wants to look into, obviously a higher fitness level in terms of us as hunters helps us be safer out there. And that's a great point. I think something a lot of people don't really pay enough attention to. I know me personally, I'm not the most active person in the off season, but typically August through August through hunting season, I try to pick up my activity, shed a few pounds, and just try to get myself in a little better shape, because nothing's worse than harvesting a nice deer a mile back in the backcountry and having to haul that out and it being the most miserable day of your life. So getting in shape and maintaining that level of fitness is certainly important, and great point, Joe. But like Jason mentioned, we're going to just briefly mention chronic wasting disease. Again, I am trained as a wildlife biologist. I'm not trained as a wildlife virologist or epidemiologist. So we're just going to go over some of the basic facts and how it relates to us as deer hunters in Illinois. So as you can see in this map, the chronic wasting disease prevalence in Illinois is basically contained in the northern part of the state. So the majority of any time you're going to be thinking about chronic wasting disease in Illinois, you will be thinking mostly about the northern half of the state at this point. Of course, it could always change. They could detect new populations that have it, but currently it's kind of located in the northern part of the state.
Hey, Dan. Just real quick, I'm going to answer one question and also make a point. So is there alternatives to hanging the deer if the weather is not good? So if you have extra space in a fridge, maybe a garage fridge or something, you can quarter the deer out and kind of have the meat just kept at that 37 to 34 degree mark. So again, you don't want to freeze it. As long as you don't freeze it right away, and it allows those enzymes to keep working, you're good to go. But if you aren't able to do that, which a lot of people aren't, it's just best to take it to the deer processor, because that's why they have those giant walk-in freezers. They can hang their deer and just have them sit there for days and not have to worry about space. So that's unfortunately how that would work out. Also, don't skin your deer and take it to the deer processor. They won't take it. So they prefer you can just gut your deer and stop there. And that's it. But if you're going to turn your deer to a deer processor, just a heads up on that one.
Okay, next slide, Jason. So what is chronic wasting disease? Chronic wasting disease is essentially a neurological disease of deer. Unfortunately, it is 100% fatal. There is no known treatment or cure. And at this point, it looks like all deer are susceptible. I know there's been some research that shows they may have found a small mule deer population that may have some genetic differences that allows it to be somewhat immune to the effects of CWD, but I know that research is still very preliminary. But at this point, it's 100% fatal. And the real challenge with CWD is the way that it's transmitted. So it's transmitted through direct contact from a uninfected deer to an infected deer. And as we've kind of discussed with the way they communicate, the way they breed, there's a lot of direct contact with deer to deer. And so that's how it can spread. But one of the main spreaders of chronic wasting disease is essentially bait piles. So I like to use the example, especially now with COVID in the news, if we were all sitting in a room and there was a popsicle sitting on a table and we all went and licked that popsicle. Well, if one of us had COVID, chances are now we probably all do. And it's kind of the same with deer. And so that's why baiting is not allowed in the state of Illinois, and most states are starting to ban supplemental feeding of deer for this exact reason, because it congregates deer to a very specific area, and that area is basically a bait pile where they're swapping saliva and these things. Now, one of the biggest ways that a state wildlife agency can manage CWD is through lowering population density. Kind of like we've seen with a lot of the stay-at-home orders. Diseases are prevalent when density is high. So staying at home and social distancing can help basically slow down disease transmission. And this is kind of the same effect, in that it's essentially harvesting more deer to lower those deer densities to hopefully restrict basically it spreading. And slime, yes, good point. This is actually an outdated map. So yes, you are correct. So as of right now, CWD is not known to be a threat to human health, livestock or pets, but recent research by the CDC is starting to raise the level of concern a little bit. Currently, public health authorities are recommending that deer should be tested, especially when they're harvested from known CWD areas, so kind of that northern part of the state. And also deer should be handled and processed in a way to minimize exposure to CWD causing agents. And what this means is the disease, again, it's a neurological disease, so a lot of it resides in the brain and in the brain stem, so the spinal column. So my rule of thumb, now that I process, now that CWD is becoming more prevalent in the Midwest, is when I'm processing and field dressing, I'm no longer cutting through bone. This has kind of changed the way I have processed deer. That's where CWD lives, is oftentimes in the bone. So I am no longer cutting through bone when I'm processing it. So that is something worth kind of thinking about. No part of any CWD positive animal should be consumed by humans or other animals. Again, it's not known to be a threat to human health, but the research is so preliminary on a lot of this, and we don't have the long-term data that they are recommending that you do not ingest any CWD positive meat. Now, if you do happen to harvest a deer that is confirmed CWD positive in the state of Illinois, they will issue a refunded tag for that specific animal. Now, if you do live in some of these counties, you can see them listed here. I won't read them all off, but if you are firearm hunting in these specific counties, you are required to go visit a mandatory check station. So historically, if you've hunted, for a few dozen years, these check stations were basically the only way you reported your harvest. Now we can do it through a phone system or through a web browser, but historically you had to go to a specific place and show your deer and tags and that kind of thing. With CWD becoming more prevalent and them needing to increase testing to kind of monitor how the transmission is occurring, they are requiring all successful firearm season hunters in these counties to go visit these mandatory check stations on the same day that that deer was harvested. And so you'll pull up to these check stations, as you can see in this picture. They'll take a very quick sample, and then they'll go ahead and send that off to the lab, and hopefully you'll find out in the short term whether it's positive or not. Now, Ed, that's a really good question. There are specific voluntary testing stations set up across the state. Now, the majority of those are just kind of drop boxes. Now, I go ahead and get every single deer I harvest tested, just to, again, it's adding data to the pool, but also for a little bit of comfort. I wouldn't feed, CWD positive venison to anybody else, so I would want to know. So I do get every deer tested, and at these basically voluntary sites, they have a bin out front of the DNR public site office with some paperwork up top that you kind of fill out a card, attach it to your deer head, and you just drop the deer head in the bucket. And then a biologist comes and checks those every evening, takes them, gets the samples, and then gets those samples sent off. Now, I saw we had another question about how long does the test take to come back? And that is one of the things I'm most concerned about this year. So that last year there was a fairly significant lag in the testing results. And a lot of that was due to multiple states starting to do the same thing that Illinois is doing by monitoring and by doing a lot of CWD tests. And essentially there was only 2 labs that could run these tests. And so those just essentially got inundated and backlogged by all the various states across the country, starting to send their tests to them. So I'm hoping they've started to rectify that issue, but again, I can't speak to that. We'll just kind of have to wait and play it by ear. I know Missouri just upped their CWD testing a lot. I know they're kind of doing the same thing in firearm season. You have mandatory testing. And so I think we'll probably see a little bit of slowdown as well, but typically it's about 3 to 4 weeks. And this is, again, where the challenge for a lot of people comes in. I mean, it's kind of I can't give you an answer. It's just something you need to think about and kind of ponder and decide for yourself. But again, if it's taking 4 to 5 weeks to get a test back, what are you doing with that venison in the meantime? And so that's the challenge, right? So either you get it processed at a processor, or you process it yourself, and then you just kind of let it sit in the freezer and wait for those test results. And that's just kind of the way it is currently. I saw we had a question come through really quick. Do we have the option to get the head back? I was thinking of keeping the skull for a skull mount. Yes. So they're actually essentially, there's 2 different sites they can sample. So one is the retropharyngeal lymph node, which is just kind of right along the jaw line. But there's also a part of the brainstem called the obex. And it's just a very small piece of the brainstem that they can just reach in, grab with tweezers, put it in a vial, and send it off. So typically, if you do want to do something with the head, they can accommodate those requests.
Great.
And with that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
Yep. We do have time for a Q&A. So if you guys have any other questions after I go through our updates and stuff, we'll have time to answer any other questions you guys may have. So you can put them in the chat now as I go over our schedule here. So if you're wanting to learn more about deer, you went through 101, you went through 102. We have a couple other courses that we have that continue talking about deer hunting. So deer scouting techniques is coming out next Tuesday, or following Tuesday, actually, on the 27th, or oh my goodness, Tuesday, September 22nd. And then we have another one that we'll probably have in early October, which is going to be tree stand placement, which is becoming one of our favorite ones to give because we just like the information that's in that one. So the scouting one goes over how to read maps and looking for deer habitat. And then the tree stand placement one is pretty similar to the scouting one, but it's a little bit more in depth than that. So those are ones you may be interested in. Some other ones we got coming up is plant ID, looking at plants that would be useful for a hunter to know. And these ones are the grassy plants and herbaceous plants. We have another plant ID that's trees and other woody plants. Then closing out the month, we have waterfowl ID and waterfowl hunting 101. So if you're not interested in hunting and you just want to know how to identify some waterfowl, check out the ID course. If you're interested in both, please come to both of them. Again, it's free. All right. So if you want to keep in touch with us, please follow us on Facebook, also our Instagram. We just update those with some pertinent information, we think. So check it out. We have any new updates that come out. The IDNR just came out with a new website this week, so you can find that link on our Facebook page. We also have a YouTube channel that we're starting to build up. So we have a few Q&As with different project managers. So we have all the different biologists on there. So we have the deer project manager, the waterfowl project manager, upland bird, turkey, and the wildlife heritage manager, all on there. Also a conservation officer, which if you have other conservation questions and you want to hear a Q&A with a conservation officer, check that one out. There's some surprising answers in that one. So I suggest you should check that one out. Actually, that one's pretty interesting. Not to say that ones weren't, but they were all pretty cool. So check those out. Okay, any questions?
Yeah, we've gotten quite a few, so I'll go ahead and start scrolling up and answering some of these questions. So we had a question from Mike. Actually, we had Mike is our kind of first question that we haven't answered. Basically, onyx hunt, wise hunt, or hunt stand. So essentially, he's asking, there's a lot of various mobile applications that have been developed with hunters in mind. A lot of them have the same core functionality in that a lot of them are mapping solutions that kind of allow you to mark points of interest, allow you to view different topographic map and other different layers. Personally, I can't necessarily recommend one over the other. I have only used Onyx Hunt. When I first used it several years ago, it filled the niche that I was looking for, and I've been happy with it, so I just kind of stuck with it. So I can't really speak on Wise Hunt or Hunt Stand. I have looked into them, and they look very similar in terms of, again, functionality, but Onyx Hunt has just worked for me. And again, it's not necessarily a recommendation, just the reality. Billy asks, is CWD a risk to the wildlife that eat the end trails? As of right now, again, the research that has been shown is that it is not. But one of the big issues with CWD is some of the new research is actually quite startling. Again, CWD is caused by a mutated protein. So it's a protein that is essentially folding in on itself. You may have heard of mad cow disease, or I think it's pronounced scrapies in sheep, or there's a human version that the name is escaping me, but it's essentially a mutated protein called a prion that just starts to kind of reproduce and really take over the brain. Now, what some of the research has shown is that plants actually have the ability to uptake these proteins from the soil and allow them to last that much longer and be that more prevalent on the landscape. And the theory is that then any other animal who comes along who eats this specific plant that may have uptaken those proteins through its root system can then be susceptible to it. So again, you can see it's a complex issue, and the science is still very new in this essentially disease. Another question from M. Wensloff, can you talk about best practices / concerns about contaminated meat, specifically regarding gut shots? Yeah, so that's a really tough one, and it's something that you're gonna have to make a personal call on. I would lean towards the more cautious side. But the biggest recommendation I can make, especially about a gut shot, is there's not a ton of meat inside basically the abdominal cavity of the animal. So this is where I see a lot of people mess up when they're field dressing, is they'll start to use that knife. Maybe they cut through the stomach or intestines, and then without cleaning that knife, then they start taking it and working on other parts of the animal. And instantly now you're contaminating that other meat. So if you do happen to nick a stomach or even the urethra, and so you get urine, spend the time to kind of clean off your knife really quick. I typically keep a small bottle of dish soap and water in my bag at all times, just so I have that ability to quickly clean the knife and get it clean. Normally, you're not going to spoil meat too bad from the actual shot. What really spoils meat is when it's left too long with the guts inside. And if that ever is the case, it certainly happens. you will know fairly instantly whether that meat is good. I was listening to, I'm sure it was one of Steve Rinella's shows from Meat Eater, but they were doing kind of an in-depth look at kind of this exact topic. And his rule of thumb is if that animal has been sitting there for a while, the first thing he's going to do is he's going to go to the back ham, so the back legs, and he's just going to cut through the skin and smell. Because again, those are some of the biggest chunks of meat. And typically he's going to get nice and deep in there. And if you start to smell a funky smell, that's when you know it's bad. So a lot of times the meat is going to tell you right off the bat whether it's still edible or if it's kind of past its due date. We had another question from Jason. Are there voluntary tests that don't require the whole head so a mount can be done? As of right now, there is not. I know they are looking to expand some of their testing capabilities so that they can increase basically voluntary testing. I don't know that they'll be there this year, especially with the way, COVID and coronavirus has been. So currently, no. Another question from Ed. If you are planning on having someone process the deer for you, do you just hack the head off and submit it to the DNR station? Good question. So a lot of it is going to be dependent upon the specific processor. Now, I will mention you need to keep the head on that animal until it is at the processor. Don't cut it off beforehand, no pun intended, but beforehand. Take that entire carcass to the processor so that because they will verify your tags and they are licensed by the state, so they do have to record a certain amount of data, like your confirmation number, after you telecheck that deer in and enter it into the system. And so just keep that head on at that point. And if you are interested in getting it CWD sampled, you can typically just tell the person who's helping you, and they'll either hack the head off and then you can take it to a site, or what I've seen, a few deer processors are now starting to have some of these voluntary stations at their facilities. Again, I don't know how widespread that is, but I know there are a few that have that. But typically, take the whole carcass after you field dressed it to the processor and just say, hey, I want to get this CWD tested, and they can hack the head off for you. Thank you, Ed. Crutchfield Jacobs. Yes. I had a question from Kyle. I've been deer hunting several times on public land and haven't even seen a deer. I know there are a ton of factors involved, but any high-level recommendations? My biggest recommendation is, and this is kind of my school of thought on a lot of hunting, is I hunt hunters. So I want to be in areas where other hunters are not. And so a lot of times, even if you're not seeing other human traffic or you're not seeing hunters in an area, that doesn't mean that they're not walking through there to get to another spot or that they're not hunting there when you're not. And so if I'm in an area that I'm just not actively seeing new sign or a lot of deer, typically that means I'm going to make a big jump and I'm going to reevaluate where I think other people are hunting. And I'm going to try to find those areas that are either too far from a parking lot that people aren't going to want to walk that far, or maybe there's some barrier. Maybe it's a real steep hill that you have to climb up, or a river or a creek that you have to cross. A lot of these things will really deter a lot of hunters, but if you're willing to take that additional step, a lot of times it can open you up into a sanctuary, because a lot of deer behavior and deer activity is dictated by hunting pressure. So finding these areas that don't have a lot of hunting pressure can often prove fairly successful. Oh, great point. By S. Share, some places that do mounts will also send out the sample needed for CWD testing. Great point. From N. Wensloff, do you need to recover the carcass if it's been out too long or if it's funky? So that is one that I personally would contact the conservation police officer for that specific county and just explain, what happened. Again, they know this is hunting. It's not just a black and white situation. They know these things happen. Many of them are hunters themselves and have probably had the same situation occurring. So I would just reach out to the CPO kind of right off the bat and see what they want you to do. But if that meat's spoiled, then you legally do not have to recover that carcass if you can prove that it is spoiled.
Yeah, another tip, Dan, is they do like it when you give them a heads up that there's a carcass out there, because sometimes people report carcasses, and
Right.
if they know that you were hunting in that area, they can kind of chart that off to you being there. And that was something that we actually covered in the question and answer session we had with the CO officer.
Now that's a real tough question, Ed. Ed asks, how long after the deer dies in early season temperatures do I have to get the deer to the processing facility? And that's again, so I'll give a backstory. I went to college in Kentucky, so I hunted in Kentucky a lot. Now Kentucky's archery season started September 1st. So they're already hunting, and it is very warm. I happened to harvest a deer on September 1st, opening day, and it was 75 degrees, and I promise I will never do that again. So now I'm very particular about days I hunt. If it's going to be over 60, I'm not even going to spend the time to go, because the main reason I hunt is, again, to get this nice quality venison, and I don't want anything to spoil that. So I'm going to take the opportunities that are nice and cool when I have a high chance of recovering that deer. Because again, even if you're a perfect shot, we're shooting arrows and bullets at live moving things. And so a lot can happen between the time that you pull that trigger and the time it impacts the animal. And so even if you're dead set, you're a perfect shot, if you're out there in early, October and it's really warm, you're going to want to get that meat cooled off as quick as possible. And about 30 minutes to an hour is about as long as I'd be willing to wait once it, when it's above 70 degrees. And so a lot of those days I will just kind of go ahead and just call it a day and plan another day to hunt. Cassandra asks, if the meat isn't good anymore, what is the best way to get rid of the carcass? So again, that kind of depends whether you're on public or private land. If you're on private land, you can leave it. Now, if you're on public, legally, you cannot move that carcass. If you are not going to tag it, you cannot move that carcass. So just leave it where it's at. But again, like Jason mentioned, call the conservation police officer and tell them what happened. But if you do want to do anything with that carcass, you are then going to have to void your tag and fill your tag with an animal. So if you're not going to recover it, just call the CPO and tell them where you left it and, hey, this meat's spoiled, and they'll kind of help you proceed.
Another point, real quick, just getting rid of carcasses. It is legal if you process your deer at home. You can just take it out with the trash, which some people are surprised by that. But yeah, you are allowed to. You might freak out the garbage man the next day, but that's the way they recommend getting rid of the carcass. Some people like to go and dump them off roads, but that's a good way of spreading disease and stuff like that. So please just put it in a garbage bag and put it out the trash.
Yeah, perfect. Another question from M. Wensloff. Do you not eat any of the meat you harvest before you get your CWD test results back? At this stage, I personally do not. And I know it sucks, but that's just kind of the way it is. I am willing to kind of wait and see, because again, I just know the science is so early on it. I would hate to figure out in 15 years that it causes these severe neurological issues and blah, blah, blah. So I am willing to wait, but again, that's a decision you can make for yourself. Ed asks, average price to fully process a deer. Now that's a great question, and it's really going to depend on what specifically you want. Now the typical processor is going to charge you your standard processing fee. So that's going to be where they're going to quarter the animal out and steak it. So you're going to get your steaks, your roasts, and ground deer. Now where the processors really make money is when you start getting into specialty items. So the average kind of processing where you're just getting your big roasts, all your steaks, and everything else is just being ground into burger. That's roughly $100 to $125 depending on the processor. That's kind of a standard price I've seen. But when you start adding, breakfast sausage or jerky or, all these other things that take prepping and cooking and other ingredients, specifically a lot of these products use pork fat, that does increase the price substantially. A lot of them, you might get a pack of bratwurst, a pack of 5 or 6 for $3 or $4 a pound, or it kind of depends. But that's where you, where you spend a lot of the money is when you start getting into the specialty items. Yeah, that's about what mine is. But again, I get a lot of specialty items like sausage, bratwurst. Italian sausage is really good with venison.
Yeah, and hot sticks, those things.
Yeah,
but they're worth it.
They are worth it. And that actually brings up a really good point. And before you get to a processor, be thinking about how you want to utilize this meat. Do you want to keep it in big roasts so that you can maybe smoke a big roast because you're going to have to be thinking about that on the spot. So it's nice to at least have an idea of kind of what you want to do for this meat. So I would just Google whatever your county or city you're near is, just Google deer processors and near here, and you're going to find a few. And just kind of poke around on their website, see what their prices are. They're all reasonable, but a lot of times they have very funky hours. A lot of processors will basically fill up their entire walk-in freezer and then shut down for a day or two, process all those deer, and then start the process over again. So some of them have weird hours. I know the one I've used here near Champaign, Illinois, which is Riverbend Deer Processing. They're only open, I think, between like 5 and 9 p.m. to drop off your deer. So just be cognizant of those strange hours that a lot of them have. And Ed asks, how much freezer space does a deer take up all broken down? Is it pretty much required to have a chest freezer? Yes, it is. Unless you want to give a lot of your meat away, which there's a lot of people that do that. You can also, there's a program in Illinois called Hunters for Hungry, and it's essentially you donate your venison to homeless shelters and to needy individuals so that they can cook it and have their own meals. So that is an option. But yes, you will likely need a chest freezer. Now, if you harvest a young doe, you may only get 35 pounds of take-home meat off of that animal. Where if you harvest maybe a 4.5-year-old buck that weighs 225 pounds, and then you get a lot of sausage products where they're adding more meat to it, you could fill up an entire chest freezer on one deer if you go that route. So yes, chest freezers are kind of a necessity for deer hunting. Question from M. Wensloff, is it a good idea? Any tips about hunting nearby states? Is it worth looking into that? That's an interesting question. It's something I kind of struggle with every year. Now, typically for whitetail hunting, I'm not really going to go out of state. Illinois is in a lot of places known as the prominent whitetail state. But again, like you mentioned, access is limited. So if that's something that you're cognizant about and access is a constraint, then yeah, I would definitely look into some other states. But Illinois, especially if you're going to bow hunt, access is not readily available, but it can be done. Gun and firearm hunting, that's where things get a little bit tricky because they limit so much of the basically how many people are on each individual public land just for safety and to make sure everyone has enough room. So yeah, Wisconsin specifically, yeah, Adam hunts Wisconsin a lot. He can probably talk to you about that at some point. Wisconsin has a great deer herd. But again, their CWD prevalence in Wisconsin is a lot higher than it is here in Illinois. So if that's something you're concerned about, you may want to look into that. There are areas of the state where they have identified 40% prevalence of chronic wasting disease infected bucks specifically. So just kind of be on the lookout for that. We had another question. What type of hunting stands do you recommend for a beginner gun deer hunter? Now, if you're a gun hunter and you're just beginning, I honestly probably wouldn't start out with a tree stand. That's the nice thing about firearm hunting is you don't have to get as close to the animal. So deer hunting, we're trying to get them, or with bow hunting, I'm trying to get them, to walk on this exact trail. Where gun hunting, you're really just trying them, in a lot of cases, to enter your field of view. And so it gives you a lot more flexibility. So I think just starting out on the ground would be a great option for any firearm hunter.
Just to add on to that, if you are looking at getting a tree stand, it's really personalized to what you're comfortable with. Like I know Adam is really comfortable going up climbing sticks and going and sitting on a platform up on a climbing stick. But I prefer the climbing tree stand. I just feel safer. I'm enclosed and I don't need to climb up a ladder. Even though you do have a harness on, you can move it up the tree as you go up. But it freaks me out. Adam, on the other hand, gets freaked out going up in a climber. So
yeah, it's really all preference. I mean, it's hard to say. You got to try it out because you have to, unfortunately, probably buy it before you try it. But yeah, I mean, it's preference. If you have friends that hunt, see if they have a stand you can borrow and just kind of test out before you really dive in and purchase one. Because, for example, I have a climber right now. I used it for about 1.5 seasons, and I'm selling it now just because I want to buy another hanging hunt stand due to the fact that do not feel comfortable in those climbers. So yeah, just a thought.
And we have one more question from Ed, and we're gonna have to cut it off here soon. Sorry, but this will be kind of the last question we address, and then we'll kind of end it for the evening. Ed asks, do you guys hunt in the rain, or at that point are the deer just going to bed down? Some of my personal favorite hunting trips are in the rain. Now, if it's pouring rain and lightning and thunder, I'm not going out. But if it's a nice drizzly, just kind of misty, constant rain, those are by far my best days to hunt. There's a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, the rain helps knock down some of those scent molecules to the ground. And number two, it really helps silence your options. So a lot of times when I'm hunting in the rain, I'm going to be doing a lot more, I don't want to say stalking because it's not necessarily stalking, but I'm more active. So most deer hunting, you're just sitting in one spot and just kind of waiting. Where with me, when it's kind of raining, I will be a lot more mobile and up and moving because it gives you that flexibility to essentially move around a lot quieter. So yeah, do not be deterred by rain. It will, if it's pouring rain, it will make tracking a deer a lot tougher. So I may be a little more selective in my shots, but yeah.
Yeah, just with everybody asking about tree stands and other things, I put it in the chat, put all your money towards being comfortable. The longer you can stay out there, the more chances you're going to have of seeing something. So have warm clothing, have rain gear, have boots, have good socks. That's going to be your first thing you want to try to put your money into. And then the tree stands and all that stuff will come afterwards. You'll build that up over the years. And
if you do want to look for a tree stand and you're adamant about it, one of the best, I hate saying this because I'm just giving away my secrets, but one of the best places to find used hunting equipment is garage sales, Facebook Marketplace, and Craigslist. A lot of my hunting equipment, except my method of take, so a bow or a gun, a lot of it is actually secondhand. All of my waterfowl decoys are secondhand. There's a big classification of hunters that are very, very, very gear intensive, and they want the newest and greatest every year. So typically right after the season starts kind of wrapping up, that's when you start to see a lot of deals start to pop up on Facebook Marketplace or on Craigslist. So it definitely is worth looking into some of those options to find used, because used tree stands, they're going to work just as good as if it's brand new. But remember to check the cables and make sure it's safe and all that. But you can get great deals on tree stands through Craigslist. But with that, I think we're going to have to close it down. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us. We will again send out those list of documents that Jason mentioned. I am dropping a quick link in the chat if you feel comfortable taking a quick survey. Just kind of, we want to know about who's taking these courses so that we can continue to design some of these program offerings to better fit you, and then provide any feedback that you have for this specific webinar. So again, thank you and have a wonderful evening.